excited to be able to talk with all of you this morning, and I'm going to be talking about something that when I first talked with AUBER organizers about coming to speak was really not on the horizon at all, and I had thought I'd be able to talk about something completely different. But I think this is a really appropriate group to talk about two particular dimensions of the pandemic. And this, I really just describe this as people versus places. So we'll get into that. Like Juliet mentioned, I'm the director of the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. We are a newer research institute within the Federal Reserve System, and we live in the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Research Department. As such, these are actually going to be my views and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the wider Federal Reserve System. So I actually have kind of two, at least, pieces to this talk. And the first is to just review a bit what I was thinking about and what other folks were thinking about early on in the pandemic. And in particular, I want to revisit some of what I was doing at the end of March. And in particular, I was thinking about what kinds of data we would need to provide really timely tracking of the pandemic and to provide inputs in particular to state and local policymakers who are the ones making so many of the key decisions about how we were going to go about conducting our lives to get through this. So on March 26th, I issued a proposal for a large-scale survey, and it really had several key features that I want to highlight. The first was that I thought a data collection effort needed to be frequent and potentially daily. And so I argued for a really large-scale survey that would occur at that kind of frequency. The large-scale component of this was another key feature, and that is because I wanted us to be able to have information that was very granular so that we could generate at least county-level statistics and statistics that were reliable for small demographic populations. Again, the idea was to give policymakers who need to make those real-time, very granular decisions about how to contain the disease and to track its impacts, really the detailed information that they needed. In the proposal, I also argued that this should be a fairly long period of data collection, lasting up to 2 years, and that we needed, and this was really important, I think, a very broad lens on the impacts of the pandemic. And to that end, what I proposed, I think, looks different even still from what has materialized in the last couple of months to respond to this information need. We really needed to have a lens on health and health symptoms and behavior, but also financial health, economic well-being, and broader measures of well-being, because it was clear that this pandemic was going to have impacts on really just a variety of spheres that contribute to folks' overall well-being. So that was kind of the call. And there, like I mentioned, have been some responses to that. I want to get to those in a second, but I want to underscore some of the motivations for this proposal. And a big piece of this talk will be reviewing how things have played out in a way that lines up with what was anticipated and where things have turned out to be different, I think, than what we might have expected in March, and then conclude with some conversation about what we should be thinking about tracking going forward. So the motivation for these different pieces of the proposal, again, a multifaceted problem, so really multiple angles of motivation. First, the proposal to have a long period of data collection. I think at the time, at the very end of March, that was starting to materialize, but I wouldn't call it a universal view that the pandemic was going to stay with us for 12 to 18 months in order to move all the way through. And so I think that was a kind of speculative piece in the proposal that has been borne out, and we'll kind of tick through what's been borne out and what hasn't in a second. Another motivation was that it seemed like the containment efforts were likely to be uneven. And that was because the pandemic kind of progress seemed very unlikely to be even across space. In particular, at the end of March, we had outbreaks in New York City and Washington State, and Italy had had a fairly concentrated outbreak in a set of northern cities. China had had a geographically concentrated outbreak. And so because I'm looking forward, it seemed likely that the virus was going to appear in fairly geographically confined places and then go away and then appear somewhere else, and that would be potentially the pattern that we would experience over a long period of time. If the virus was going to be geographically disparate, a kind of appearing and disappearing, potentially the containment efforts were also going to be geographically disparate, with places having to open and close as they worked through efforts to contain the virus locally. Surveys also seem to be potentially an efficient way to track a number of things. So at the end of March, the US still had fairly limited testing infrastructure, and tracking virus spread was a real concern about how we were going to do that. So surveys potentially seem to possibly offer an efficient way to track that alongside a number of other dimensions that we also wanted to track in fairly real time. And finally, if we could have timely information on the most negative impacts of the virus, and particularly what I would call the pandemic or the COVID-19 environment. Maybe it's the virus, but really the environment we're operating in is very different. If we had disparate impacts of the switch to the COVID-19 environment, we could, with timely data, potentially release aid to support the folks most affected on a very timely and detailed basis. That was the motivation for having a lot of those components in the proposal. Like I mentioned, there has been a significant social science data response to this call for more information. The one that most closely tracks or follows the proposal I laid out is the COVID impact survey. I've been helping to co-direct that, and that's a joint effort between the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the Data Foundation, National Opinion Research Center, and a variety of other funders. We really were able to pilot in April a prototype of that type of survey that I proposed, and it has some geographic coverage. The Census Household Pulse Survey, which is actually what I'm going to rely on with the statistics I show you today, obviously I'm sure is familiar to many folks, covers all 50 states, produces statistics at the state level for those states and for 15 metro areas. And then there have been a number of other responses to, I think, really a widely recognized need for greater data collection around these issues. So what has been borne out, and what I would say, looking right now as we are in September, would one potentially want to tweak going forward in this kind of ambitious data collection effort? Well, first of all, it's obvious that a long period of data collection is something that we need to continue to engage in. That has, I think, resoundingly been borne out. The second component, this kind of geographic specificity and the specificity of the impact of the pandemic environment. This is what I'm actually going to talk about in the second piece of the talk. What we've actually seen is some geographic disparity in how the virus materializes and in COVID incidents across space. But we haven't seen that kind of geographic specificity in the economic impacts of the COVID environment. Instead, those have been more demographically focused. And that's the people versus places dimension that's in the title of the talk. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about how that's borne out and what we should be tracking given those types of conditions. I also think it's clear that the virus and containment efforts are affecting multiple dimensions of well-being, and I've worked on that. It's not the focus of the talk today. Others have worked on that. I think it's very clear that continuing to track multiple measures of well-being is really important, and that is certainly something that should be retained going forward. Then kind of turning to the health impacts. More work is going on this, and some of it I am doing and others are doing. I would say right now, and I don't want to get ahead of where the evidence is, but I would say right now it is not looking like there will be a strong ability to forecast the virus using survey data. We might get a better sense of where the virus is using that survey data. Again, I don't want to push that too hard. I think that's something that could change over the course of the pandemic. But instead, I think it's worth realizing that another health dimension we need to track is not just the virus itself, but current health. Folks have been foregoing preventative care and regular care. Access to care has slowed down as providers have had to put in place safety measures. And also we're learning about potentially long-term impacts of a COVID infection itself. So continuing to track health in some way, I think is really something that needs to be part of an ongoing data strategy here. Finally, aid that we've seen distributed has not come in a very targeted way that releases depending on very specific downturns or very specific incidents that folks might experience. Instead, we've seen fairly large, ambitious aid packages that go out to all states in a similar way and that go to all workers in a similar way. So I think it's unlikely that the aid strategy would shift to something that's very time and population specific, but we have had a hard time tracking exactly what aid receipt looks like. And that's because of some challenges with using administrative data in real time. I certainly think efforts to improve that deserve attention, but I also think survey data, although sometimes survey data on aid receipt can be problematic, is something that, again, an ambitious data strategy going forward should retain and continue to do. So I think we've learned a lot about a kind of initial view of what would be optimal in terms of data collection, what pieces of that one would keep going forward and what one would change. And now I want to zero in a bit on this particular people versus places dimension and how that has unfolded in the last few months. So I'm going to talk a bit about the geographic dimension of the disease, and then I'm going to relate that to a number of economic indicators for well-being across places. And I think, again, this initial idea that the disease would be localized, potentially the impacts will also be localized. This analysis that I'm going to show you is just a really kind of straightforward way of assessing that in a rough way. I think more work can certainly be done on this, but I think we'll get the picture of how those two things are moving and ultimately, to foreshadow, moving a bit differently. And I'm going to talk a bit about how outcomes in the COVID-19 environment have instead been very disparate across types of people, and then conclude with talking about why these relationships might exist and what we need to know going forward in light of them. So I think that these maps will look a bit familiar. I'm sure a lot of us have been looking at them on a regular basis over the last few months, but I really just want to illustrate to you how the disease has unfolded geographically. I'm showing state level per 100,000 population incidence of new monthly cases. And so those numbers are basically 4 times any thresholds that you might have been watching if you're watching a weekly per 100,000 number. The color scheme comes from the Harvard Global Health Initiative thresholds for potential population and community spread and where the breakpoints are in that. And so what you're seeing is that in April, in fact, the disease started out in a very localized way in the US. We had a large outbreak in the New England area in the Northeast. And you also see some of the orange. I don't have metropolitan areas on here, but Illinois is driven by Chicago, Michigan's driven by Detroit, and Louisiana. Also in Washington State, you might have seen a more localized outbreak there if we had kind of county level data on this. But you see that there's some specificity in where we were in terms of disease spread at the beginning of the pandemic. As the months go by, things, in a sense, follow this pattern of there's an outbreak, it kind of goes away after some strong containment efforts and potentially other factors. And then we see the disease moving around, another severe outbreak in the southwest in the middle of the summer, and then moving to a wider outbreak across the south in the summer and in the Intermountain West by July. But now New England has turned completely green, and the pandemic has waned quite a bit from there. As we go into August, we see, again, the pandemic maybe starting to wane in some of those states that had experienced bigger outbreaks in July. You see a similar pattern of this kind of blinking on and off if we look at the metropolitan areas that are, in this case, available in the Census Household Pulse Survey. That was the reason for picking these on the slide in particular. And you see their monthly per 100,000 case rates for the different months of the pandemic. In many cases, either go from not very severe and low risk of community spread to very high risk, or vice versa, kind of blinking on and off, that geographic specificity that comes and goes. And this is just another way to illustrate the way the geographic spread of the virus has been fairly uneven. So this is cumulative cases per 100,000 at the county level over the entire course of the pandemic. And you see that in the right tail, this is a very long right tail with high numbers of cases. Some counties approaching 150,000 cases per 15,000 cases per 100,000. over the course of the pandemic. But the great mass of this is actually in the left tail, with many counties experiencing fairly low levels of per capita case rates. We don't have any counties with 0 anymore, but many counties have had very low levels of this. So you see that this has been a very uneven incidence of the virus itself across space. Now, we want to just kind of understand, have the economic impacts of the virus also been uneven across space? And to preview, what I'm going to tell you is basically no, but if you were to pick certain pieces of data, you might be able to find something that looks like that kind of story. And one example right here is the employment to population ratio. So here I'm showing you 4 months of the pandemic data. These are the ones that line up with the first phase of the Census Household Pulse Survey. And each color of dot is all 50 states plus the metropolitan areas, just plotted for the different months of the pandemic. And we're correlating the EPOP rates on the y-axis with the new monthly cases per 100,000 for that month in those places. And looking at the scatter, I don't think you see a super strong relationship the way it's presented, but when we plot the linear fit, you see that the correlation would kind of roughly line up with that story of, we would think that the employment and economic effects would be more severe where the virus is more severe. If that's something you were anticipating, you looked at this graph, that's sort of what you would see. And we've plotted actually both bookends of the pandemic, so the April fit and the July fit. But not every indicator of economic security tells this same story, and that's where I think this becomes a question of what really is the relationship between the virus incidence and the economic impact. So here we have share couldn't afford the food that they wanted, so this is a major measure of food insecurity that we use. And again, if you were anticipating that economic impacts were worse where the virus is worse, you would think that this share would go up with virus incidence in a place. And instead we see that in 1 month of the data, the most recent month, but not in the early part of the pandemic. And this really changes depending on which month of the pandemic you're in. We've also done this for a number of other economic security measures. The share of folks who've experienced employment loss, you see EPOP in the first column there, the food insecurity measure I showed you, also share reporting poor mental health, a measure of kind of stress and anxiety and depression, and then the share of the population in a place that was late on a rent or mortgage payment or deferred it in the last month. And when you look at, again, just those simple correlations, the linear fit, in some cases you see, like with the EPOP rates I showed you, a picture that supports the idea that the economic impacts will be localized with the virus. But in other places, we actually get a sign flip that's really economically significant and large and statistically significant, but totally different depending on which part of the pandemic we're in. In other places, you see no relationship depending on which month you're in. And overall, I think this paints a picture that it's not so much the kind of localization of the economic impacts, it's really much more which places are having outbreaks at which times. And depending on that, you will get different relationships in these indicators. So another way to see the way that kind of the economic impacts of the virus are not that closely tied to the virus spread locally is to look at the unemployment rate trajectories for these states. So here we've plotted in red states that ever entered that red zone of very high community spread, very high per capita virus rates, and green is everyone else. And here we're plotting back to 2005, so you see the last recession. To zero in on the last 12 months, it looks like this. And you see that basically unemployment rates don't look systematically different between states that eventually had really significant virus outbreaks and those that didn't. So again, a lot of this is really illustrative, but I think it paints a picture that basically the localized nature of the virus is different from the geographic nature of the economic impacts. And we're seeing very broad impacts geographically, even though we are seeing virus kind of come and go in particular places over the course of the pandemic. So now I want to focus on where has the impact of the virus been differential. And in particular, we're going to look at workers and types of workers, and then we're going to look across space at these types of workers. So what we've plotted here is a change in employment rates. Other indicators, I'm going to say, look broadly similar. I don't have time to go through all of them. And what you see here is an overall change over the months of the pandemic from a pre-COVID measure obtained from the American Community Survey prior to the pandemic, compared to the same measure asked in the Census Household Pulse Survey. And you see on the kind of left of your screen, impacts for race and ethnicity groups. And you see what I think many folks already know is a really disparate impact that falls disproportionately on non-white workers and households. In particular, a very large decline in employment for Hispanic workers, also very large decline in employment for Black non-Hispanic workers. But I don't want to understate, there's been a significant decline in employment across the board. Workers of all types have experienced this, but where those kind of breakdowns and fault lines are happening tends to be that workers of color are experiencing more of a downturn than other workers. We also see this for workers without a college degree. We have kind of, you'll see somewhat noisy impacts for folks who have don't have a high school diploma. There are very few of them in the Household Pulse Survey, so I'm going to kind of put those off to the side. But broadly, workers without a college degree are seeing much more negative declines in employment rates than workers who have a college degree. Also, younger but still prime age workers relative to workers who are somewhat older, and then also bigger declines for men than for women in employment. So I want to just illustrate how this has unfolded across places. So here you see those same kind of demographic group breakdowns, in this case the race and ethnicity breakdowns, but the dots we're plotting are those places you were seeing earlier in the scatters. So this is the decline for example, white workers in every place in the Census Household Pulse Survey compared to its pre-pandemic level. And the fact that these clouds are shifting to the right indicates that employment rates for whites in all places in the US are lower than they were prior to the pandemic. And as you go through other groups, you see that this is also true across the board. Workers of all kinds have experienced declines in employment rates, but that rightward shift has been bigger for Black and Hispanic workers than it has been for white workers. But it has not been localized to particular places or not. And that same pattern carries through if we do this exercise with education groups. All places, again, kind of noisy for those folks with less than high school diploma, but all places have shifted to the right in terms of lower employment rates than prior to the pandemic, but bigger rightward shifts for those without a college degree. And same with the age groups that we saw and the gender differences that we saw, a larger rightward shift for men relative to their pre-pandemic employment rates, but this is true across places. So the fact that these economic impacts carry through so systematically across spaces is really what's underpinning that kind of lack of a systematic relationship between today's virus incidence and today's economic, local economic conditions. And so I think this raises the question, of course, of why these two things are moving somewhat separately in the US economy. And there really are several reasons. I suspect evidence will be forthcoming for all of them. I've highlighted some places where we already have pieces of that evidence. It would be an exaggeration to say that anyone has run these against one another or that we've done a decomposition to say this is the biggest factor and this is second. I suspect, though, that we will find out more about that as researchers continue to focus on this. But really those three explanations for why you see these consistent impacts across space are threefold. One is that there are significant linkages across US markets. And I think the pandemic has really emphasized this. In particular, a working paper from the Institute from Ashoknahin and Popov is showing, really illustrating those sectoral linkages across industries. And this carries through across space in the US as well. So those linkages across markets are really important, meaning that when we shut down a couple of areas in order to contain the virus locally, we are really having cascading effects throughout the economy that affect folks broadly. We also have seen, I think, in spite of a lot of national conversation about this, fairly common behavioral responses across space, with many folks engaging in the same self-reported protected behaviors. We see this in the survey data that I've helped collect. We see it in other survey data. We also see this in high frequency administrative or big data like cell phone data and retail data. Basically, dining out in restaurants is down across the board. Engaging in these self-protective behaviors is up. And those are causing some of the, certainly a significant share of the economic impacts that we're seeing. And when those are common across space, regardless of the level of local virus, we are seeing definitely a kind of spread of that economic impact that moves differently from the spread of the virus impact. And finally, and this again is ongoing research, the connections across distant markets in the US in the form of travel mean that the US outbreak maybe isn't as localized as we'd anticipated. And I think this is really very much the frontier of understanding the virus spread through the US. But certainly we've seen, I would say, pretty significant large areas of the US be affected by high levels of virus. And this potentially suggests that the virus in the US is not nearly as geographically contained as it might be in other countries. And this really gets to these kind of cross-country studies that are very much ongoing. So just a few concluding points to underscore what I think we've seen. We have seen an expansion and recession on a per capita basis of the virus that is uneven across the US. Maybe it's not as uneven as it could be or as it is in other countries. And again, that's the ongoing research piece. But for the most part, you see this local expansion and contraction in the virus. And although some indicators suggest that economic impacts, particularly on the labor market, are going hand in hand with that expansion and contraction, it really, I think, would be a wrong interpretation of the data to say that those two things are closely linked. Instead, I think we're facing a situation where the economic impacts of the pandemic are not as localized as the infections. And instead, the heterogeneous impacts we are experiencing are clearest across groups of people and groups of workers who are more impacted by the particular nature of the protective behavior and shutdowns that most places are putting in place in order to limit spread. So it's not that there are no fault lines in the pandemic, it's that these are really, it's not unfolding in a way that's very linked to where the virus happens to either be or has been. So given this, what do we still need to know? And this is my last point. I think we need to know really two things that we are not currently getting great data on, and I'll be hopeful that folks will talk about this in the panel on federal statistics coming up. The first is the impact of infection on earnings, employment, and health, both kind of immediately and in the long run. And this is something we can start today. Folks who get this infection are taking time away from work, for significant periods of time, and we don't really know what is happening to their earnings and their other measures of well-being when there's an actual infection in a household. We don't necessarily need to track this longitudinally, but this is easy to track in a cross-section and will help us understand potentially the lasting impacts of this virus if we were to start collecting that health data alongside the other economic outcome data we are already collecting. The second piece we need to know is just more detail about safe behaviors. This is knowable, and I think it's unfortunate that we haven't been able to learn more faster. I don't think there's been a kind of systematic effort to do that kind of science, but it's very possible to set up studies that are going to help us understand what protective behaviors are essential and what are not. And if we can kind of keep that to an essential level, we potentially can engage in some more of the activity that many folks are self-limiting right now. So I don't think we know all of that today, although certainly there's more that we know now than at the beginning of the pandemic, and much more is knowable with a bit of a concerted effort to figure out the safety of certain types of behavior versus others. And I'll stop there and hope that we have time for just a couple of questions. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much. And we absolutely have some time for questions, and we've seen some good ones come in. So first of all, thank you. I appreciate you sharing all of that data. Incredibly helpful, and it's a good reminder to us who are, to those of us who are working, advising policymakers, you know, in our states, the resources that are available to us. So thank you for that, Dr. Wozniak. So maybe I'll start with one of the questions that was in the Q&A. And you mentioned, you kind of alluded to this, but can you comment or just provide some insights on the CARES Act influence it on the relationships, if any?
Yeah, and I had intended to mention that and flew through that. So I think absolutely some of what we see in terms of the way that these different outcomes unfold could be the result of CARES Act and also economic impact payment support that went out pretty much in April. A huge bulk of the EIP payments went out, and then ongoing through the summer, additional CARES Act support, particularly in the form of additional unemployment compensation. This is where collecting these multiple pieces of information becomes so important, because what we are seeing, I would say, is a bit of a kind of confusing picture where we know lots of payments went out.
Yeah.
We know these are large. They are big dollar amounts compared to folks' bottom line. They should have big impacts on income, and some of the income data that we've seen even suggests this. Folks are reporting that they got this income. On the other hand, food insecurity measures have not moved systematically with that. They have changed incidence a little bit between different demographic groups, but if you look at food insecurity overall, it has been fairly level across the pandemic, and in particular, the measure that we track, which is affordability, has actually worsened, even as these payments have come out. Missed rent and mortgage payments, that has been pretty flat. So I think the question is, how are folks using this support? And it's too early to say for sure, but I think there's some evidence that folks are saving it, anticipating that it wouldn't last through the pandemic, and need it. And so you both have high levels of insecurity alongside high levels of support payments that have gone out. So that's just a really hard data picture to get on top of, and continuing to collect those pieces will help.
That's great, thank you. And kind of along the same lines, given the research you've done and you're working on, what are your policy recommendations for more heterogeneous economic aid? What would be your next, if you were, able to completely, make the policy intervention that's right? What would your recommendation be?
Yeah, so certainly I think there's wide support. I would say a number of other Fed folks have called on Congress to continue support that looks something like what we saw in the CARES package, whether it takes exactly that form or somewhat scaled back, or switches to somewhat to additional economic impact payments. I think there are details important details, but those are things that can be worked out. I think the key piece is ongoing support for workers and households. A piece that I didn't touch on is support for state and local governments. And I do want to underscore, because this sometimes comes up when I talk about this, that this is not to say that local governments don't need additional support. Yeah. To kind of say that the economic impacts are not very base concentrated is that economic costs to local governments are not present. And in fact, that's really one of those sectors that's being disproportionately impacted as revenues have declined, employment has contracted there, and continued support for that. That's really a sector is also important.
Great, thank you. Well, so speaking of sectors and by local government sector, we had a question come in around just what you're finding and how it relates back to diversity in industry and within these regional economies that are seeming like they're clumping together, what role the sector mix is playing and what you're seeing.
Yeah, so I think that I was a little surprised to some extent that that pre-existing service sector concentration in our analysis, it kind of comes in the way you would expect, but it doesn't fully explain the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's because even in places where the service sector is really large, you still have a large share of the economy that is connected elsewhere. And there's a big part of the service sector economy that is not geographically concentrated. That's been a really interesting and important development over the last couple of decades, is just how non-concentrated some services now are. They provide services across space, the internet, as opposed to we always think of the service sector as haircuts that you need to visit to actually get. It's also, for example, the online lawyer business is part of the service sector economy, and it's now very geographically decentralized. So service sector is certainly important, and places that have a larger service sector have seen these bigger declines in employment, but it hasn't been as important as you might have thought. It doesn't explain all of that diversity and the economic impacts, and that's because of those sectoral linkages that are tying different places together in complicated ways.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we're just about to wrap up, but Dr. Wozniak, maybe you can answer one last question and or request for your insight, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on how, we as economists with our, access to data, skills, connections with policymakers, I mean, how can we locally be helpful in advising on this?
So I think that setting expectations is potentially really important. And that's really hard to do in an environment like this, where this is very new to us and it's new to the folks who are most expert at it, which is the epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists. There's a lot we don't know about where the virus will go and what the intensity will be. But I think it's useful to underscore to policymakers that the economic and social impacts they're seeing are going to be somewhat separate from the virus impacts.
Yeah.
And that's an important expectation, because I do think one of the kind of patterns we've seen is that as the virus recedes, folks immediately open up, I think on the assumption that there's this kind of like one-to-one trade-off in terms of the economic impacts and the virus. And in fact, we're not seeing that so much across the board. So I think making policymakers a little more comfortable with these two things might work differently would be really valuable.
That's great. That's great advice. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Like I said, I think that your work is now, always important, but now more than ever. And I know that we all have a lot to take back to, the work we do. So thank you. Appreciate it. You'd have a big round of applause if we were all together, but hopefully we'll be able to see you in person at some point. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Wozniak.
Awesome.
And with that, I will turn the time over to my very good friend, Rich Wabakin at the University of Colorado, Boulder, who will introduce our next keynote speaker.
Well, thank you, Juliet, and it is indeed my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Altig. He's the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. In addition to advising the bank president on monetary policy and related matters, Dr. Altech oversees the bank's research divisions, which include the bank's team of economists, the Regional Economic Information Network, and the bank's Community and Economic Development function. Dr. Alteg is an adjunct professor of economics in the Booth School at the University of Chicago, and he's currently vice president-elect of the National Association of Business Economics. He is also a member of the Advisory Council of the Global Interdependence Center and serves on the board of the Constance Seminar on Monetary Theory and Policy. He has past and pending published research in several prominent professional journals that we're all familiar with, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Econometrics, the Journal of Monetary Economics, and the National Tax Journal. Prior to joining the Atlanta Fed, Dr. Altig served as Vice President and Associate Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. And prior to the Cleveland Fed, he was a faculty member in the Department of Business Economics and Public Policy at Indiana University. He graduated from the University of Iowa with a bachelor's degree in business administration, earned his master's and doctoral degrees in economics from Brown. He and his wife, Pam, and this is a particularly interesting little tidbit, have 4 children, 6 grandchildren, and 1 great-granddaughter. And since he's younger than I am, I don't have a great-granddaughter. I'm totally jealous, Dave. So some of you may recall that he spoke at our 2018 national meeting in Salt Lake City that Juliet hosted, where he received absolutely rave reviews. I totally expect this to get rave reviews, but I don't expect it to be the same after the last 6 months. Please welcome Dr. David Altig.
Thanks, Richard. I'm assuming you can hear me. Is that correct? Give me a thumbs up. Good. And I'm not on screen because I'm being coy, but because it says I can't share my video because I've been stopped. So that's okay. I'm better heard than seen in any event. I wish I was in, there we go. I wish I was we were in Boulder, but we aren't. So we'll make the best of it. I was interested in Juliet's last question to Abby about what economists can do during this fairly challenging time. I gotta confess that every time I give one of these presentations, I start thinking about the movie Seven. And so there's this scene, you all know this, the scene at the end where Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt are out in the desert with the serial killer John Doe, and the box with the terrible surprise sort of shows up, and Morgan Freeman calls up to the circling helicopters and says, "Highway Patrol, back off. John Doe is in charge now." So I keep thinking that the COVID has basically delivered the economy's head in a box. And I want to say to all my colleagues, back off. The disease is in control now. And we have very, very little to say about it. Now, of course, that's not really true, because the course of the economy, although highly dependent upon the disease, interacts with the policy choices that we make in light of the disease. Some of that is public policy, and a big part of that is public health policy, of course. But fiscal and monetary policy are front and center and germane. I'm going to talk about monetary policy, not too surprisingly, but fiscal policy is perhaps the biggest player in the whole mix. And I want to just say at the outset that, I'll show you kind of the forecasty sort of stuff near the end here, but all of that is predicated, at least from my point of view, and the point of view of us on the staff at the Atlanta Fed, on at least some continuation and extension of modest fiscal policy support. What's modest? I don't know, something in the neighborhood of $1 trillion plus dollars. And needless to say, if that doesn't come to pass, then I certainly would feel like I need to kind of revise my views on things. I'm contractually obligated to repudiate any notion that the comments I make reflect those of the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, at least the person at the top of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I will deny it if you say otherwise. So it's been a very eventful month in monetary policy, with the announcement of the new monetary policy framework by the chair at the Jackson Hole Conference at the end of August, and then of course last week's FOMC decision, which put that new framework into action. And I want to talk about that for a little bit at the outset, but the first thing to note is that this is not really a new development. Unfortunately, I don't know if you can see the source down there at the bottom, but this is the comment from the chair last July 2019, which was the beginning, the official beginning of the so-called framework review, where the Federal Reserve and the FOMC conducted a full review of its communications, its strategies, and its definitions of maximum employment and price stability in particular. That was an extraordinarily intensive activity. And basically every meeting from July through January was devoted in large part to not just the usual monetary policy decisions, but to these discussions of the framework and what the future role of the committee's tools would be in promoting its goals of maximum employment and price stability, and indeed whether those goals would be redefined or refined in a particular way. That activity was meant to wrap up in the spring, but of course COVID delayed things for several months. But now we finally come to the end of that trail or at least the end of the beginning of that trail. So here is so the outcome of the framework review was really in important ways to redefine the notions of price stability and maximum employment in ways that they had not been defined before, what we called the framework. So in July 2019, when the framework review began, here was the notion of the price stability strategy. The committee had adopted a flexible inflation targeting regime, which meant the following. The committee would seek to achieve and maintain 2% annual inflation, the rate that was determined as the one most consistent with price stability back in 2012. And this other important element, which is it was not really deemed to be a framework in which the committee would sweat too much over overshoots or undershoots of that 2% target. That is, looking forward, the aim was to always sort of hit 2%, but if they missed it on the high side or the low side for some period of time, bygones would be bygones, and there would be no effort to engineer an above or below 2% inflation rate to make up for those misses. That's what has changed on the price stability strategy. Rather than a flexible inflation targeting approach, the committee has now adopted a flexible average inflation targeting approach. The 2% target hasn't really changed, but what has changed is the committee is no longer inclined to let bygones be bygones. It would seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, meaning, and this is the explicit language from the consensus statement, that if following periods when the inflation rate has been running below 2%, the committee will actually attempt and conduct monetary policy in a way that attempts to engineer above 2% for some time, moderately above 2% being the important clause. But that wasn't the only important change in the understanding and approach to the FOMC's mandate. The maximum employment strategy changed as well. Again, thinking back to the beginning of the framework review in July 2019, the best way to explain kind of the approach to maximum employment was in terms of a symmetric loss function that was driving the approach taken by the committee. It meant there would be no specific numerical goal for what maximum employment meant, but whatever it decided it meant at the moment and going forward, the goal was to mitigate deviations from that assessment in either a direction. That is, if we were to simplify this, and I am simplifying it just for purposes of the discussion, to think about unemployment, the committee would sort of make some determination of what the natural rate or equilibrium rate of unemployment is. And it did not really want to see unemployment rates fall below those levels, and it did not really want to see unemployment rates rise above those levels. And so monetary policy would be engineered to keep the unemployment rate as closely as possible to that assessment of the level consistent with maximum employment. Again, I'm simplifying because it's not meant to be just about the unemployment rate, but for purposes of illustration, it's a convenient way to think about it. That's changed. The notion of a broad definition of maximum employment is still with us, but the loss function or the implied loss function is no longer asymmetric. Policy decisions will be informed by the committee's assessments of the shortfalls of employment from its maximum level, not deviations from its maximum level. Those are the words of the consensus statement, but in common language, it means, look, if the unemployment rate is running low relative to our assessment of maximum employment, we're not going to worry about it as long as the inflation objective is being met. So this is now very much a one-sided approach. We're good with higher employment than what our assessment of maximum employment strategy might be. We will lean against, of course, employment levels that are too low, unemployment levels that are too high. Those are very, very material changes in the framework around which the committee is operating. And the operational result of that in the current post-COVID environment looks like this. This is from the Summary of Economic Projections released last week after the FOMC meeting. And it's the forward path, the median forward path to be more specific of the federal funds rate target through the end of 2023. And basically what you see is 0, 0, 0, 0. So the way these Summary of Economic Projections are constructed, as I'm sure you all know, is that the committee, each committee member is asked to supply their assessment of what the appropriate funds rate target is going to be under monetary policy and under the economic conditions that they see going forward. All 17 participants are submitting their own views on these things, and this is the median of those. Not all of the submitted values for the future funds rate, particularly out into 2022 and 2023, are 0, but the consensus certainly lies there. And given this change in the objectives statement of the committee, and given the economic projections going forward, it's pretty easy to understand why you have no lifting off of the floor of interest rates for the entire projection period. Essentially, the operational aspect or element of this new framework was in the statement, is that the committee is going to keep the target range for the funds rate at 0 until labor market conditions have reached the levels consistent with the committee's assessment of maximum employment, and inflation has risen to 2% and is on track to moderately exceed 2% for some time. So if you look at the projection for the unemployment rate going forward, there is a slow decline in the unemployment rate, not reaching 4% until 2023. That is obviously above still the pre-COVID unemployment rate, and is about on target with the committee's central tendency of what the long run unemployment rate looks like. So at the very least, this is not a projection suggesting that maximum employment will be, that condition will be satisfied until 2023. And if we look at the inflation outlook, you get essentially the same thing, that 2% target, not expected to be met until 2023. And as a consequence, you do not expect, given the statement, the forward guidance that was given by the committee in its decision last week, the conditions for liftoff to take place. There's a couple obvious questions that sort of come out of this. One was asked by Bloomberg's Mike McKee to my boss last Friday. I said, no, wait a minute, you're telling us you got this forward guidance and you're not going to lift off of the 0 floor on interest rates until you hit 2%. You haven't hit 2% in a long time. So why do you think that that's going to happen anytime in any reasonable horizon? And I'll give you the answer that my boss gave, which actually is something I talked about when I talked to this group last fall in Savannah, which is it has been our view and continues to be our view at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, that we were actually much closer to on track for that, hitting that 2%, and had been since about 2017 than is commonly accepted or commonly articulated or believed by many. This is a direct quote from Raphael. Just before the crisis, many of the signals of inflation were at 2%, if not above 2%. And what we were talking about was basically that Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas trim mean, which is, it turns out, a pretty good predictor of future inflation. And even though the headline inflation rate was sort of moving away from our target, you know, and we had in play many of these sort of special factors like wireless telephone bills that had huge rates of deflation in them. It was our contention that we were not really substantially off track of that 2%. And indeed, last year when I showed you this picture, one of the things I focused on was the momentum slide that had the last 6 months rather than the year over year headline PCE, which was moving pretty rapidly at the time up to about 2%. So I don't think this is a pipe dream that we will be able to realize 2%, but it is the case that that 2% is not viewed by the committee, according to their summary of economic projections, to arriving very quickly. Nor is a full recovery of the economy. And that's sort of the picture. These are the lessons I sort of want to leave you with. Here are the GDP growth outlook, again, according to the summary of economic projections. Above trend growth out through 2023, but not above trend growth that suggests anything like a rapid recovery in the economy in any way. So I want to just to put some perspective on this. This is a plot of the trajectory of the level of real GDP during the Great Financial Crisis and the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, and what the forecast looks like going forward. Here I'm using blue chip, but they look very much like those FOMC summary of economic projections. And I've normalized both of these lines at 100%. At the beginning of each of the recessions, 2007 quarter 4 for the Great Recession, and then of course this spring for the current one. And according to the projections of these GDP forecasts, very much like the ones I just showed you, it will still be well under the level of GDP that we had been at immediately pre-COVID, immediately before the recession started, even by the end of 2021. So it's a very, very slow trajectory back to even on GDP growth. Employment is the same picture, even more extreme. So here is essentially the same sort of reference points that I showed you before. The blue line again is the 2007-2009 recession, and then the green and the green shaded area is the range of all post-World War II recessions for 2007. The red, of course, is the trajectory of payroll employment following the COVID shock. And, you know, this is a picture that speaks for itself. The trajectory back and the recovery has been pretty sharp, much sharper than what we would expected, but it's not one that I think gets us back to any semblance of even for quite some time. And here's the results from the Duke Richmond Atlanta CFO survey that we conduct joint with, as the name might suggest, Duke University and the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, where we actually ask businesses, what do you think things will look like in terms of your own expected cumulative change in employment by the end, from pre-COVID to the end of 2021, and better than a 2% less employment than what we enjoyed in February of this year is still in the minds of businesses. So once again, a very, very slow recovery and an uneven one. And this is a picture that comes from our survey of business uncertainty, which is a picture of, according to the firms in our survey, and it's a national survey that we conduct joint with Stanford University and the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. This is a picture of reallocation within the economy. Basically, looking forward, we attempt to account for how much reshuffling of jobs across businesses and across sectors is going to take place and at what rate. Once we've accounted for the normal reshuffling that accounts for the net change in employment, it spiked, of course, dramatically in early spring and late spring. It has recovered and bounced back somewhat, but the pace of job reallocation is still expected to be almost twice what it was at this point pre-COVID, and is growing. And here's a picture that basically tells the same story looking backward that you all know about. The impact across sectors is very, very much different depending upon what sector you're talking about. And unlike the 2007, 2009 recession associated with the global financial crisis, which was about a shortfall in goods, not so much in services, it's all completely reversed. And it is our view at the Atlanta Fed that this is not going to be just a cyclical adjustment, but sectoral changes and structural changes are very much in our picture, which leads us to come up with our own sort of view of what the letter is that describes how we think the recovery is going to go through. So we've decided, well, we don't like V for sure. We don't like L. We don't like the Nike swoosh. What we like is the less than recovery, is what we've been calling it, which is this is very much going to be a recovery that looks like a less than sign, with certain sectors growing and gaining throughout the recovery, and certain losers and sectors lagging, and in fact permanently being impacted as the recovery proceeds, which will proceed in our view for quite a while to come. So let me stop there, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that might come up.
Well, thank you so much. Those were great comments, and I'm sure we have a couple of questions already, and I would ask the other participants in the session to type in their questions that your presentation has raised. The first question is, are you concerned that the numerous and various facilities take us down the road in a direction that we may not want to follow too far? Is the Fed becoming too big for its britches?
Well, yeah, so that's a tough question to answer, in part because the facilities have not been that big in the sense that the take up on the facilities across the board, with the exception of PPP, which is pretty much fully subscribed, and the swap lines, which have run down quite a bit, they have not created a large literal footprint. Of course, the question we don't know is whether or not their mere existence creates a fairly large footprint. In fact, the whole intention was for them not to create a large footprint, but rather to provide confidence as a backstop so that kind of markets could proceed as normal. That seems to have worked. Now, how long that support is going to be necessary and what it's going to look like when that sort of support is removed is a really good question. The committee has not, and the board have not indicated any intention whatsoever of feeling like we're in a position yet to begin to talk about the winding down of those facilities. But hopefully, I mean, the notion certainly is that that can happen and will happen on an orderly in an orderly way. So the chair has been very insistent that these are emergency facilities. They are not intended to step in and provide permanent support for the market. They are certainly not intended to address structural issues. And that is the intention of the committee, to remove that when the time is appropriate to remove them. And the fact that the markets are kind of functioning fairly well with minimal support is at least some amount of a promising signal.
Right. The questions are just flowing in here, so okay. I'll keep you busy for a few more minutes if you have the time.
Sure.
If the Fed was hitting the inflation target using the FRBD trim and other signals you and Dr. Wozniak mentioned, why was it necessary to change the inflation targeting framework?
Well, there was a concern. Well, so first of all, I should probably say that Raphael's public position and our position was not the consensus position. We were sort of more optimistic and more sanguine, quite frankly, than many of Raphael's colleagues. So there's that. There is the question, though, of whether or not inflation expectations were anchoring below 2% just by virtue of the fact that even though we were arguing that the trajectory looked pretty good, the headline inflation had not really reached 2% on any sustained basis for some period of time. So the intent of the framework change, according to all the documentation and the chair's comments on these, was to say no. We want inflation expectations to be firmly anchored at 2%, and we think that the best way that we can guarantee that will be so is to shift to this average inflation targeting and engineer policy so that an overshoot becomes a part of the picture.
Thank you. There's just a flurry of questions on your winners and losers, so I want to elaborate on this a minute. So here, when people see that graph, they call it the K, by the way. They don't call it the less than
Yeah,
sign.
I know. We didn't like the K because we didn't understand the vertical line. So
And I'll just say I'm saying the swoosh because I'm adding those things together and saying it's going to take a long time for some industries and not for others, and so you're going to get the absorption, but that's fine. Somebody here called it the alligator mouth, so you're hearing it all. But people would like to hear a little bit more about who, elaborating on who the winners and losers are going to be.
Yeah, so it's not a big mystery. In some sense, I think what we believe is happening is the acceleration of stuff that was going to happen anyway, but was happening on a much kind of slower, much slower pace than what we have seen by necessity and are likely to see going forward. So, I mean, the prime example is, online retail versus bricks and mortar. This is, nothing very startling about that comment. But we've been hearing for years that these adjustments were looming. And all of a sudden we get this event, and the effect of this event is to accelerate that trend with a lot of disruption. Now we begin to think about what's going to happen to commercial real estate and whether or not, even though the real estate markets are looking quite good at the moment, whether or not as we kind of figure out what the new configuration of work is going to look like, how is that going to shake out with respect to, for example, office space. By the way, it's not so clear because on the one hand, you may have fewer people working in offices, but on the other hand, you may want them more distanced. So for the same number of workers, you need a bigger footprint. So, you know, how that race plays out, we don't know. Some of this is going to be temporary. I mean, I would suspect that the travel and leisure reshuffling will go away, but it will go away slowly.
Okay. There was a sub question that I didn't ask amongst all of those questions, which was, do you think it has any policy implications?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, because you know, monetary policy is a powerful weapon, a tool. I like that better. Tool rather than a weapon, is a powerful tool to address demand shortages. It's a very poor tool to address structural change. So sorting out which is which is really quite challenging for monetary policy. I mean, if we're seeing what looks to us like weak growth, and it's a result of kind of this structural reshuffling, then attempts to impede or redress that issue, you know, are really sort of kind of in vain. You know, we can support as much activity as the economy can take, but, you know, attempting to promote faster growth is really sort of not what monetary policy is well suited to do in these structural situations. But if it's a demand problem, then that's quite a different thing. And monetary policy can be very powerful and move us forward very quickly. So it's a very difficult issue to try to kind of navigate those interpretations.
Okay, we're coming up on the end of the time, but if you let me ask you one more question, and then we'll say thank you, thank you, thank you. You noted that the conclusions of the review was, quote, the end of the beginning. The new forward guidance language on rates that reflects the committee's review findings is deliberately vague. Do you expect the language will need to be further refined to remain credible with markets and the public?
Well, I don't know I don't know. But I mean, there will be decisions to be made on balance sheet policy going forward, the interaction of those things. There's the famous paragraph 5 in the statement, which articulates that, you know, if certain circumstances might arise that the committee would want to address that aren't delineated in that forward guidance, they will do so, and they will remain flexible. And what all that stuff looks like, I think, you know, will be kind of will unfold as we go forward. The real test of all of this becomes the point at which the committee believes that you know, this extremely accommodative stance, and very specifically zero interest rate stance, is appropriate going forward, and the market begins to believe that it is not. That's when sort of the proof becomes in the pudding. So the committee has made a bit of a commitment, and I think the real power of this change in the framework comes into play right exactly at that moment.
Well, thank you very much for being with us and supporting the AUBER annual conference. Your comments, as always, are thoughtful, insightful, and it's just great to have you with us. So we really, really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to pass the podium over to Pat Barkey, and he's going to take us from here.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Dave. Great presentation. Thanks for getting our conference off to a great start. Both you and Abby Wozniak, it's fantastic to have you on the conference. So my job right now is simply to announce that we're taking a break, and we can check our net worth and see if it's changed after Dave's comments. And I know I'm going to have to work for at least another day because I have to manage this conference, but let's take a break and resume again at 12:30 Eastern promptly for our first panel. Thanks so much, and thanks again, Dave, for the great talk.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk today about COVID-19's effect on state tax revenues. And we're going to try, there are a couple of, I think, important things to say up front. There have been a number of studies on this. AEI, Stan Vuger, just published a nice piece on state tax revenues and COVID. Tim Bartik did this considerable amount of work, as did Brookings, early in the pandemic to try to frame the size that the CARE Act probably ought to be to deal with this. And so we have sort of two innovations here that we think are kind of helpful. First, we're going to do three different simulations, three different scenarios, and we'll learn more about which one of those is most appropriate in a minute. Second, we did our own estimation of elasticities here. And then I think finally, we're going to look at the burn rate on the rainy day funds. And so without any further ado, let's walk right into this work. The first thing I want to talk about is these three different scenarios that we have. I didn't have a K. I averaged the K scenario into the Nike swoosh. So we sort of have the most likely example we've been talking about is this Nike swoosh, which looks very much like the CBO's forecast. I'll talk about that in a minute. The roller coaster forecast, which is the possibility of extreme closures and openings as COVID passes through areas, which I think sort of hints back to what we saw with Abby earlier today. And then an L shape, which are far deeper downturn possible scenario. And just to put these in historical context, if you look at annual changes in GDP over the past 75 years, you can kind of see that when we're talking about these scenarios, we have the L-shaped and the Nike swoosh scenarios are farther down off this list of a dozen, dirty dozen here. But the L-shaped scenario is right up there with the worst of what we saw either in the Great Depression or right after World War II as GDP slumped in third quarter. And then the Nike swoosh is right at about the CBO's current projections. And the roller coaster is a little bit better, but a little bit worse second year. So let's just see how these things stack up and how we estimated this. The first part, I just want to talk about the estimation here. You know, we have two tax bases and GDP and personal income. And we, of course, have to evaluate the elasticity of personal income with respect to change in GDP at the state level. I'll talk more about the data in a minute. But we used a error correction model that's been used before. Holcomb and Sobel are the first two that presented this in the tax literature. But if you see, and those were the same ones that Stan Vuger and AEI used in their recent study. We have the tax instrument, which I'll talk about in another slide. We have the long-term elasticity across its base, and these are natural logs. And then we have the asymmetry adjustment, because we know that adjustments to equilibrium in the long run are going to be different whether or not you're above or beneath equilibrium tax revenues. And then we have an error correction model from whether assessing whether or not tax levels, collections were above or below long-term equilibrium in previous years. So what we went with here across all 50 states was an assessment of tax revenues, assuming that we were above equilibrium in 2019, given the relatively good year that was. I calibrated that even in the Midwest, which was seeing the effects of a manufacturing downturn. Tax revenues were above estimated values. So we use that as sort of our base here, but that's one of the pitfalls of these studies. We looked at 4 direct tax instruments: sales, personal income tax, corporate income tax, gaming revenues, and then we assumed that the other taxes that comprise anywhere from just over 12 or 15% to about a third of tax revenues for each of our states responded at the average of these 4. So we just assigned them an elasticity, which is common in the literature. We used data from the National Association of State Budget Officers, their tax data collection from 1997 to 2019. And again, these 2 tax bases from the BEA or personal income or GDP. We're working in nominal dollars here. That's really where budgeters work. And so that's our process here. There's some econometric considerations in our estimates. They're, these are not a panel integrated series. It's a fairly short period. So there are some stationary data series. So we didn't use first differences. The loss of explanatory value was too high. And again, we don't know the current equilibrium for first quarter 2020. So we're making some assumptions about previous years as we move into this downturn. So there are some issues about any of these modeling. We just want to be upfront with them right away. Here's the elasticities that we measured for states. If you see a blank, it's because that instrument doesn't exist within that state. So you're getting, and I'll show you the next slide in a minute, pick out your state here, see if this makes sense to you. And I'll go on to the next bunch of states here. And so you can see that these elasticities, if you've seen the literature, these don't look oddly different from the literature that exists. There's a lot of reasons to expect elasticity differences based upon the base and the limitations on the base for things like sales tax, the type of gaming which is being taxed, and the methods that states allocate or use as their base for income tax. And so here are results real quick. The Nike swoosh scenario, this is sort of the best case scenario, shows state losses varying significantly from between 0 and about 5% in a few states that have more property tax and sales tax base. These are states that where there's a great deal of inelasticity here, at least in the short run. And then the worst case scenarios are going to be, for example, here, states that have either more gaming or are engaged in a significant amount of, have a very high reliance on a single instrument. And then we'll swap to the most severe scenario. Same scale here. This is the L-shaped scenario where we're seeing losses that are now closer to 10% on average. I'll show you these in comparison in a minute. I just wanted you to see the map about how these play out. Now let's turn our comparative losses. I want to compare our 3 scenarios against over a 2-year period against the 2008 to 2009 period, the comparative loss. For the Nike swoosh scenario, which is our best case scenario, we have a 2-year loss of about 5.3% for Alabama. It rises to 10% of total tax revenues in both of the second 2 scenarios over a 2-year period. So we're looking at rather significant losses across a number of instruments for each state. It gets much worse as we look at that L-shaped downturn, which keeps us at GDP at about 93–94% of 2019 in real terms to the end of 2021. Now let me go to the next round of states. Again, significant. Under Nike swoosh, we're looking at tax losses that are not terribly indifferent from that which we experienced in the Great Recession, but we're looking at, by the way, these are not cumulative, they're average losses over these 2-year periods. So it's not that we're comparing 1 year on average for these, and I'll talk about some of the weaknesses in a minute about the timing issues here. These are just state taxes. Part of the problematic feature here, and you can see some really deep cuts, for example, for Nevada, is that the elasticity estimates that we apply are historical, which we don't really have a service sector downturn to model across the previous downturns that we have data available for. You know, quite frankly, the effect in Nevada, for example, which is experiencing rather grim losses to casino gaming and sales tax, are likely to be considerably worse than what we model here. And that's just part of the challenge that we face in modeling this. And then what we wanted to do was to compare the losses that we have to the existing rainy day funds. So NASBO does a very good job at reporting the rainy day funds that are available. They use only the general fund rainy day fund. So most states have a general fund rainy day fund, and then some other specific funds that are used for targeted purposes, road building, public services of some type. So we're only looking at that general fund rainy day fund, even though some of the other areas are rather large. And so we have it, you know, I've collapsed these just to show you the remaining rainy day funds after second quarter. And so you can already see, as of second quarter, by our estimates, about 6, and this is the most optimistic scenario. This is the Nike swoosh scenario. There are already 6 states that we think are down in are already essentially used or deployed as revenue replacement, if they did so, 100% of their rainy day funds. And you can just see, as time passes, we're moving to the point where almost all states have exhausted their strategic reserves or rainy day fund. And so the median state, 50% of states had passed into red by first quarter of 2021. And so we were looking at just a handful, 8 states, 9 states, and by the end of 2021 that still had rainy day funds available. And I should say half of those are within the range of well within our any sort of acceptable forecast error here in this Nike swoosh. So this is a pretty grim prognosis in terms of just the revenue side, that the lost revenues are going to exceed the rainy day fund for the median state by first quarter of next year. And it's already, you know, several states are already facing it. Not too many that are surprising. You know, Illinois and Kansas have done fairly poorly fiscally. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, these are all sorts of states that are suffering already significantly with their revenue, their rainy day fund, the revenue collections. And so let's talk a little bit in the time we have remaining about what we think are problems with this study. So, you know, the first one is obviously state revenue effects are going to persist beyond 2021. None of our scenarios have us moving entirely out of the business cycle by the end of 2021. And so we would expect the number of states past 2021 that are not, have not pushed past their threshold of their rainy day funds to be 2 or 3 states. So this is a broad and rather significant event in terms of state tax revenue. We didn't model local revenue effects. Local revenues are half or more of the state revenue in most states. They're going to be significant, but more lagged than most state level effects. So we see the effects of these persisting well past 2022. And so the states that we're familiar with, we can see already property tax effects lagging into 2022, 2023. And that's what we've seen, as you heard Dr. Altig talk about, pretty good housing markets recently. The property tax effect is obviously in the future, not in the past. And so that's going to be a real issue for many states, particularly in states that have a very high reliance on local government payments for property taxes. Our scenarios may be optimistic. The Nike swoosh is fairly optimistic, but we don't know what will happen, example, for the scenarios if we were to observe a the K-type recovery, where there were significant savings by higher earning households, or those who were winners, may have significant effect on the more elastic instruments that we're talking about. And the pandemic here appears to be more damaging to the most elastic tax instruments. So what we see across the board are big losses in some of the other taxes, the food and beverage tax, obviously sales tax on consumer non-durables are going to be very heavily affected by the pandemic. And then for many states, losses to casinos could equal 50% of a year's take, which is much more than any elasticity estimate would suggest, simply because so much GDP loss is concentrated in that visiting sectors. And we just don't know well into 2021 or 2022 what the persistence effect of that. And then I think probably the gravest error in any sort of projection of scenario like this is we're looking only at tax revenues, not increased demand for public goods and services. So as we sit here now, states are borrowing money. Even states with large rainy day funds are borrowing money for unemployment insurance. Indiana's announced it's borrowing $300 million, which is in about 6 weeks at the current burn rates for the state. It's got about 14 or 15% of employees, January's employment base on the UI fund, so that's a significant burn. And we also don't know, while the CARES Act backfilled roughly the rainy day fund for Indiana, so about 10 or 11% of annual revenues spread out over 2 years. We just don't really have a good handle yet how much additional public services are going to be required as a consequence of this. And so those sort of weaknesses to the study, I think, are typical in these areas. But bottom line is, we're talking about state revenue, not looking at local revenue, but state revenue, which is sufficiently damaged that I think that the calls that you've heard by other economists for expanding the CARES Act to backfilling state and local revenues, I think, are more salient now than ever. We're talking about significant reduction in public employment and public spending in calendar year 2021 without some supplement that's going to be affecting virtually every state in the union. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, John.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. Don't go anywhere because we'll come back with questions at the end. So stick around. And next up is Steve Miller.
Okay, thanks, John. Let me get started here. So is it good on your end?
I can see it just fine.
Okay, so it's going to be a little bit of a change of pace from what Mike did. I noticed Mike highlighted Nevada. It's Nevada, not Nevada. If you say Nevada, we know you're not from Nevada. So I'm going to give you a pictorial tour, a cook's tour of what happened in Las Vegas. And I'm going to show you some heart-stopping charts. So let's get started. So indeed, I always refer to Las Vegas as the ground zero for the Great Recession. We knew that was a housing bubble collapse, financial crisis, but it was clear, certainly in Las Vegas, it was a collapse of the construction sector that was the major component. We in Las Vegas, we went from about 14,000 jobs, and within a couple of years, we were down to 36,000 jobs. So 114 to 36,000 jobs. That was quite a collapse. This time is different. This indeed is clearly a 100-year event, although times may change going forward. The difference was as the government shut down, lockdown, lockout. It was not the case that this recession occurred because of markets misadjustment or some problem in the markets that led to the recession. And the construction sector was deemed essential so that it didn't collapse here in Las Vegas. So COVID-19 in Las Vegas, my take on the situation is that COVID-19, the pandemic and the economy are linked at the hip. And you're not going to solve the economic problem until you get a solution for the pandemic. So the effects of the pandemic are largely focused on what I'm going to call the gather together sectors. So leisure and hospitality, eating and drinking. Here in Las Vegas, we were now embarked upon sports entertainment. So tonight you can see our empty stadium for the football game. I encourage you to tune in, take a look at the facility. It's beautiful, although it'll be largely empty tonight. Doctors and dentists, hospitals, all the gathered together sectors have been hurt. We were hurt big time in almost each sector. And in order to recover, we need to get a handle around the COVID-19 problem. Here's a quick picture of the share of employment by industry in Southern Nevada or in Las Vegas. The red line is leisure and hospitality. You see that it was up around 35% back in 1990. It slowly declined down to just under 30% in 2019. So we're heavily reliant upon the leisure and hospitality sector in Las Vegas. Interestingly enough, in Nevada, Reno has been following a different path. They started out about the same place in 1990. They're down at around 15% employment in leisure and hospitality in 2019. I think the national number is around 11%. So here's an index that we track at CBER. It's the Nevada Coincident Index, and it includes taxable sales, non-farm employment, and gross gaming revenue, major components in Southern Nevada's economy. We use the Department of Commerce method to construct it, and the gray bar here represent the recessions in Southern Nevada as determined by this index. So the Great Recession is the large gray bar there, 2007 through, it extended into 2010 locally. Although the national recession was shorter, our recession was not only longer, it had a longer duration, but also it was deeper than most other metro areas. If you look out at the right end, you see that the current recession started in December. The peak was December in 2019, and the trough, the bottom at the moment is April of 2020. Here's a picture of Las Vegas employment, non-farm employment, and non-farm employment was at about 243,000 employees in February of 2020, and then it fell in 2 months. In April, it was 152,000, and now it's recovered to 220,000. You notice there at the very last point, it sort of is curling around a bit. Now the real question is what's going to happen to it off into the future. If you look at this chart, you say, well, that looks like a V-shaped recovery to me. Well, that's because I started in 1991 over here on the left-hand side. In some sense, I'm prevaricating or lying with charts here. If I only did it from 2019 now, that V would be stretched out and would look more like a U possibly, but it still looks like a V to me. Here's the taxable sales inside Nevada. This is Clark County taxable sales. It fell below the prior peak back in 2007 in April. Taxable sales were at $4.2 billion in December of 2019. They fell to $2.5 billion in April, and they've now recovered back to $3.4 billion in June of 2020. And they recovered a little bit more than 50% of the loss. Question is what's going to happen going forward? Once again, I would say that looks like a V to me. So here's gross gaming revenue. My goodness, look at that. Gross gaming revenue was about $863 million in December of 19, and it fell to 4 million. So 863 million to 4 million in April of 20. And all the casinos were closed. It's basically online revenues that we're talking about here. And by June of 2020, we were back to $531 million. Once again, more than 50% recovery. But it, you know, that if you go back and compare this recession with the recession, the Great Recession, it's remarkable that when I talked about the Great Recession, we talked about the ski jumps over in Scandinavia in the winter when you swoosh down the ski jump and then off into the wild blue yonder. And this looks like you're falling off a skyscraper, I think. Here's the unemployment rate in Las Vegas. Prior to the Great Recession in February, our unemployment rate had reached 3.7% in Las Vegas, and it jumped to 34.2% in April, almost a tenfold increase, and is now residing at 16.4% in July of 2020. And once again, it looks like it's moving a little bit sideways, but we'll have to see. New numbers are coming out in the not too distant future. We also construct at CBER a tourism index. This is for Clark County. So this includes the passengers at McCarran Airport, gross gaming revenue, and the hotel motel occupancy rate. And it was around 120 in December of 2019, and it fell under 70. This is another way that you can prevaricate or lie with charts. Notice that the origin is 60, not 0. If I put 0 down there, that would scrunch the chart upward and make that drop seem less dramatic than it actually is. And it's now recovered to about 103 or 4 on the index. Looking at the components, however, it's really dramatic. Here's the airport passengers. In December of 19, we had 4.3 million passengers come through McCarran. And in April of 2020, it was 153,000. So 4.3 million to 153,000. And we now recovered back to 1.1 million. The air passengers have been slower to recover. Of course, we do have another avenue for tourists coming to Las Vegas. That's California, Utah, and Arizona. Drive-in traffic is back up, but we rely heavily on airport passengers. This is the hotel occupancy rate. It was right at 90% in December of 19, and it fell to 2% in April. 90% to 2%. Talk about trying to plan what you're going to do. Of course, the casinos were all closed, the hotels were shut down. But the occupancy rate is now at 42% and rising. Once again, I think all the charts, at least to me, signal a V shape. You may disagree. I anticipate your questions. Here's Clark County visitor volume. Visitor volume was at 3.8 million in December of 19. It fell to 115,000 in April of 20. And now it's back to 1.5 million in July and headed up. So here's the, CBER also puts together a construction index. The construction index includes construction employment, commercial permits, and residential permits. And the construction index has not seen a big effect yet. It's down just a hair at the right end of the chart. One thing that's contributing to that is the stadium is pretty much completed. They have some more work to be done there, but it's a small residual workforce that's working at the stadium. Resorts World is still trying to finish up as well. So we have some major projects that are completing. The Sphere is still on hold. So what's driving that is is housing construction. The housing market is booming locally. Here's the construction employment, and we see that it's down a little bit, but not significantly. So what are the risks to the recovery? I think if we have a failure of the reopening protocols, so the governor has a pretty heavy hand in trying to manage the COVID-19 and the reopening of businesses. So at 11:59 last night, bars reopened. Tonight, as I said earlier, we have the Raiders are playing. They're in the stadium, although the stadium will be empty. The governor had to shut down the bars, so we've had up and down in terms of what has been allowed, and careful management of those protocols will be key in my mind for the economic recovery. I think a failure to pass some CARES Act extension might be devastating to not only the whole country, but certainly here in Las Vegas. A second wave of the virus, we're hearing bad news in Europe as they're back above their previous peaks in terms of cases, and I'm hearing some stories about New York City is maybe experiencing some problems. And finally, if we have a bad flu season, that could add to our troubles. So I haven't got my flu shot yet, but it's on my agenda looking forward. So with that, I'm going to end, and maybe we can have some lively discussion of the issues here. Turn it back to you, John.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate that. Same thing I said to Mike, stick around and we'll come back for Q&A in about 15 minutes. And now we'll pass it along to Fred Treyz.
Thank you very much, John. So I wanted to talk about the Corona economy, which is a name coined by Tobias Reynolds, who helped me on this project. And basically the Corona economy is we're unmoored in terms of how we looking at fiscal policy, looking at monetary policy, how we work, how we socialize, how we educate, very much unmoored from what we have known previously. And so I think that more than ever, we need to have ways of understanding potential paths that the economy could take, potential policy responses, because there's so much uncertainty. So I want to give an overview. Then I'd like to sort of delve into methodological questions of how to go about looking at the interaction between national and regional economies, and then a discussion of widening inequalities. So first, COVID, we know, changes everything. Fiscal and monetary policy is with $3 trillion added to the deficit, massive, unprecedented Federal Reserve response. Political has really changed in terms of the authority that the state has taken on, demonstrations, a national election, need I say more? And then there's lots of uncertainty about short, medium, and long-term policies to take place under potential scenarios. The longer
you don't have a presentation. You don't have a presentation, right, Fred? Just to make sure.
I'm trying to present right now, John.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't. I just want to make sure there's no oversight there.
Do I need to share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. And we see COVID.
Yes.
It says COVID changes everything.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can see it just fine.
Okay, okay. And then, you know, and then the longer that the economy remains socially distanced, more likely short-term changes become permanent. And then there have been dramatic disruptions in commercial real estate and transportation. We're not quite sure of the role of public transportation into the future, energy, tourism, services. So I wanted to say is, how do we look at understanding a potential economic forecast or a scenario for a state economy like Nevada or Illinois or any state. So I'm suggesting that the protocol needs to be bringing into play expertise about the national economy, and then also expertise about what's happening on the state economy or regional economy. Just as we saw with Nevada in terms of looking at hotel occupancy, critical industries. So our premise would be, you want to start with a forecast from experts who are looking at thinking all the different changes, the fiscal policy, the CARES Act, international trade, the monetary response, to understand what's happening at the national level. Then you would want to create a regional or state level forecast, starting just sharing out that national level forecast, and then to be able to have a regional or state level model where experts can take that baseline forecast and then modify it based on what's happening to particular industries, to particular key sectors. So that one would take the national forecast, GDP, personal income, employment, use that to drive a national baseline model, and the regional model, and then you can use additional information through policy variables to look at incremental effects on the regional level. So we see here, if we just take a national employment forecast, then we see a drop in employment, a V-shaped recovery. And if we use that as a driver for a Florida forecast, then we get a similar pattern, but taking into account somewhat the industry distribution. And then in this protocol, we suggest that once you have sort of this naive top-down Florida forecast, which is just driven by a national macroeconomic forecast, then you can go down and look at what's happening in the tourism sector in Florida, and whether that needs to, this forecast that comes out of the national forecast needs to be modified to reflect more specific what's happening on the ground in Florida. And then next I wanted to just speak about widening gaps. And COVID, as we saw in the first presentation, has exacerbated racial inequalities in the US. People of color are less likely to hold jobs that can operate remotely, which has led to layoffs in key service industries. And then there are also higher risk to hold in-person jobs deemed essential, potentially exposing to COVID. Women are overrepresented in social interaction, but I can see again from the previous presentation that actually male workers have been somewhat more impacted. And women certainly are more likely to assume responsibility for childcare as schools close and go remote. And then a final way which disparities have been exacerbated is in wealth inequality. Asset prices, housing prices, stock market, are remaining relatively stable or rising, while there's a simultaneous downward pressure on wages. And then for this, the modeling methodology to understand how these industry changes impact various racial and gender categories is you can take industry employment scenarios at the industry forecast, translated into occupations using the NAICS SOC matrix, and then into effects by race and sex using occupational composition data, IPOMS. There's also a demographic shift on the supply side. Labor force participation rates have dropped very sharply since February, 1.7% below February, and it's unequal across various demographic groups. Down 5% for Black women, 4% Hispanic, and labor productivity also may be long-term impacted if the educational system has been disrupted so that students aren't learning what they normally would have learned due to school closures and the difficulties of remote learning. So that could have a long-term labor force productivity effect. And then if we look at GDP as the total employed labor force times the labor force productivity, there may be some long persistent effects of lower labor force participation rates and potential reductions in building worker skills. The one thing to note is that a labor force decline, a decline in labor force participation rate may be fairly difficult to reverse. And then we just have a scenario here. It shows employment as a drop in a red line, the labor force drop, and the GDP drop. So I just put in a 1% exogenous labor force participation rate drop in 2020. I left it out at a fixed rate to 2025. And the top line shows a corresponding drop in employment, labor force, and GDP. So basically, we can look at, are these effects persistent? What does it mean if they're persistent? And also, just generally, since there's so much uncertainty about how the world will evolve, it's very important that we start thinking about various scenarios to inform public policy. And then back to you, John.
All right, thank you so much, Fred. Really appreciate all three panelists. Great job. Let me see. One question just came in. I'm going to ask my own question to Mike first. I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and ask my own question first. So Mike, I'm going to be spending a lot of time over the next month or over the next 6 weeks working with policymakers in my state. What advice do you have, for me to give those policymakers on how to best manage a
yeah, tough question.
Given state?
Yeah, so
yes.
I'll send you our simulations. We'll have them up in a paper later on in the next few days on our website. There's a great deal of uncertainty that's driving this, and the natural argument in West Virginia or as in any other state is, why shouldn't state and local government also bear some burden of the financial effects of this downturn? And I think the answer is that the twofold. First is there are public services there that are critical to recovery, and then secondly, there's just the magnitude of a layoff or reduced spending, even if layoffs aren't part of the picture, to extend the downturn well past the time that it could otherwise, we could have faced. The difficulty in the estimates that I have here, I think anybody's trying to do this, is not just the uncertainty about the economy, but the rather unusual focus of job losses and how that may change the elasticity estimates of the revenue. So, I mean, what you just saw from Dr. Miller is just a great example of how wild this is going to be for casinos and any sort of gaming and visitation. And I think one of the big keys is for state legislatures to go back to their federal elected officials and say, we need some sort of extension of the CARES Act for state and local government, or we're going to be making significant cuts in 2021. Then the other thing I didn't talk about, I don't know how much this is going to play into the overall demand side for public services, but if school experiences are anything like what we're seeing in the college town that I'm in, then summer of 2021 is going to be a summer of school remediation. I mean, I think maybe a third of Hoosier students are getting very different educational experiences, long periods without contact with teachers. If this is still happening in February and March, and there's nothing to say it won't, then I think we could expect very significant loss to learning outcomes that would have to be remediated. Now, and my back of the envelope answer to folks in my state is that's somewhere between 15 and 25% of an annual budget to do a summer remediation for schools.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Mike. I don't have any other questions, actually. I do have a comment from Herb Holloway. Herb, great to hear from you. Actually, I miss seeing you in person. Herb says it looks like it's going to be a square root recovery. So that's pretty cool. I like
I meant to use that.
Got a question for Fred here. How can a macroeconomic policy model recognize unequal outcomes across racial groups?
I think just from a purely technical standpoint, is you can evaluate how income categories are changing, and then you can also crosswalk from the industries over to which demographic categories are impacted by changes in employment in various industries. I think that may be just a more mechanical, technical way of accounting for that than the questioner wants.
Well, thank you so much for your response.
Yeah.
I've got another question here. This one's actually going back to Mike again. I was wondering if we could hear a little more explanation about tax elasticity and just the definition of that, what that means.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I saw that question. I mean, very straightforward is that there's in any elasticity is percentage change in quantity with respect to a percentage change in price, or in this case, a percentage change in tax revenue given a percentage change in GDP or personal income or sales of goods, the tax base. And so the elasticity that we measured is just the responsiveness to each of those tax instruments to the expected decline in GDP or personal income that's modeled in our scenarios. And so if you look at a downturn in the past or a recovery in the past, we know what GDP change was and how much that affected the tax revenues. And then there's a couple of challenges to it that it was in that third slide. One is it's not symmetric. So the tax revenue growth may be less in a period of time when GDP is growing quickly, and it may be much higher in a decline. So that's asymmetric. And then we also, if taxes were in a previous year extraordinarily high, then beyond what we would anticipate equilibrium would be, then the catch-up period might result in a lower tax elasticity. So normally in long-term elasticity is easy to measure. It's the short-term dynamics, which is the case that we're worried about today, that is more difficult. And so our model here is just a pooled time series of 50 states and their experience across each of these tax instruments. What causes the most obvious variation between states in the maps is the composition of your taxes in your state. So if you have obviously a lot of sales and a lot of personal income, it's going to be more responsive than if you have, for example, a lot of other taxes, which are going to be sin taxes or property taxes.
Great, thank you, Mike. Now, Steve, got a question for you. Will in-person gaming be a casualty to virtual gaming, akin from a shift to e-commerce from traditional brick and mortar retailing?
Well, I think that the switching may be over exaggerated in every area, because every time, so COVID is a big event, obviously, and so we think it's going to have huge effects. I sat through a conversation about work at home versus working in the office, and the theme of the presentation was, if you go back post-World War II through the present, there were various times when people said, hey, we're going to be working at home, we're going to be working in the office, and that just really never transpired. There were small effects, and they were predicting that we would have a small effect from this event as well. My takeaway is that we like to socialize with people face to face, and that's important. And we're sort of depressed being at home alone working. Okay, so your spouse is there with you, maybe. Hopefully you enjoy your spouse, and that's a good time, not a depressing time. So of course there may be some of that will take place, but I think that we're gonna go back to normal. I'm looking in Las Vegas, and people love going to the sports book and sitting there, and they now have the sports book set up with the chairs socially distanced. It's really sort of interesting. And you don't have to go too far. Just look at one of the president's events around the country. People don't seem to care. At least the people that attend those events don't seem to care. Or, well, anyway. Do I have an answer? I don't know. I'm just speculating. I think socialization is something that people really desire, and it's a strong pull to bring people back together. A lot of people are going to wait until we get a handle on COVID-19, particularly if you're my age or if you have an underlying condition. So, it's a tough issue.
Great, thank you, Steve. And I have one more for you, actually. Have you done a comparison to how Clark County's economy has fared through COVID compared to other tourism-heavy counties in the country? And if so, are there similarities or differences?
Haven't done that yet, although we have a new entrepreneurship center here, and I'm working with the director of research there. We've been putting together a huge database to try to look at some of those issues. And then my economic analyst, just for Fred's interest, has been working on trying to do the effect of COVID-19 on Clark County using REMI. Because we're usually when you do REMI, you have to make some assumptions about what the effect's going to be. Well, as we move through time, we're getting those assumptions fulfilled, and we're plugging those in. Anyway, we're trying to do that. So a lot of things to be done out there that haven't been done yet. Have to wait for the data to arrive.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it from all three of you. I would give you an applause, but I think the Zoom webinar doesn't give me the applause icon. So I'll just give you I do like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's the end of that panel. I'll pass it over to Tim Slaper, who's going to moderate the next panel. Thank you all so much. Tim, are you there? I realize we caught you about 4 minutes early. Well, if Tim's not there, I'm going to start, and that's fine with me. Here's our next panel, and here we're going to look at how COVID has affected federal statistics. This is going to be, very much of interest to all of us, I think, considering we all rely on these federal statistics very, very heavily. We'll have Andrew Hait. Hold on, my computer's locking up. An economist and survey statistician with the Census Bureau, and then Michael Dalton, a research economist with the Office of Employment and Unemployment Statistics at the BLS. I guess I will start with Michael Dalton first, continuing my pattern of following alphabetical order. So Michael, go ahead and kick it off, and feel free to share your screen.
There we go. Yes, so I'm going to talk about both some interesting things happening with some of the surveys at Bureau of Labor Statistics, as well as some of the results that I've managed to string together over the last few months, both to deal with the extreme isolation and boredom sitting at home so much. I've put a lot of work into looking at a few different aspects of what's happening with some of the employment statistics. And I think there's a lot of interesting stories that are happening. In particular, I think this is a nice complement to what Abby presented at the beginning. So hopefully everyone will get something out of this. So just to make sure we all are on the same page and set the context for the results I'm going to show, there's a pandemic happening. All right, good. That sets it all up, and now we can move on. So even though I am a federal government bureaucrat employee, I'm going to actually start off talking about some of the new sources of labor market data outside of some of the surveys that we collect at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The reasoning is I think it makes for a nice comparison between what is available and what is both in terms of new data, and then also what does the current federal government surveys, what do they cover, and the sort of information that people might not be fully taking advantage of, which is what I find very interesting. So the people at Opportunity Insights have actually put together a pretty cool website where they've pulled together all these different sources of data, many of which I've never seen any researchers or local governments or anything like that using. I've used Burning Glass, which is a job postings, essentially a database that they provide that has lots of information about online job postings. But all the rest, I've really never heard of these being used for research purposes. So like Homebase, Womply, Earnin, it's really interesting. And so these Opportunity Insights people, they've managed to create some interesting statistics about both the economy and things that are happening in the education sector, and they're telling some unique stories. But then you also have to wonder, do we really need to rely on these private data sets in order to say something about the economy? And so, what is the potential value of some of these new data sources? So first thing I think that they like to focus in on is that they're very timely, right? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly data is available within 3 weeks of collection, right? So the employment situation comes out the first Friday every single month. And we are using, in order to construct those numbers, the current population survey and the current employment statistics survey, both of which are collected and then thrown together, and we have the raw microdata as well as the statistics from them in a matter of 3 weeks. So that's still pretty timely in terms of trying to get a handle on what's happening with the economy. Another thing that they will say about these private data sources is that they have large samples and large aspects of the microdata that allows you to look at maybe specific geographies or specific aspects of the labor market. Well, the current employment statistics survey collects data monthly, and it comes from over 600,000 work sites every single month. So if you want large data, that's a survey that's already being collected and has been collected for many, many, many months, many, many years, and we have that consistently. And the nice part about that is it is a representative sample of the overall population of establishments. So even though with this new data, you can get a lot more detail with it that you wouldn't otherwise have with some of the surveys that the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects, there is a legitimate concern and a legitimate question of how representative is this data actually. So what, one of the angles I've taken over the past few months has been, how can we just get creative with the data that Bureau of Labor Statistics is already collecting? And my attention was drawn to the current employment statistics survey, the CES, because A, it's such a large sample, and B, there's this aspect that I haven't seen any research actually take advantage of. And I'll talk about that in a second. So this is, I think everyone knows the CPS by name. That's the household survey that's used for the employment situation each month. I'm not totally sure if people are as familiar with the CES, and that's the employer side of the employment situation each month. So when they talk about how many jobs were added or not, and by industry, that's coming from the CES. And so it's obviously it's going to be monthly, it's a large sample. And here's the part that's really cool, is it's actually longitudinal. And this is the part that researchers have not taken advantage of, to my knowledge. And so this is the first time that we're actually using the longitudinal aspect of the CES to try and construct measures of the economy and see how employment changes. So the way I'm doing that is it can all, and then the other cool part about this, of course, is being able to then link the survey responses to the administrative data that we have at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which can then also be mapped to other surveys that we're collecting, because a lot of times there's going to be overlap between some of the surveys. So the longitudinal part of the CES, I think what makes this useful is that it allows for tracking a single establishment from month to month. And what that would potentially be useful for is A, it says how, whether or not an establishment closes, even if it's temporary. And then the second piece is we can compare the employment relative to the pre-pandemic levels, right? And I think that's really useful for being able to see how the economy is evolving over the past few months, and then also going into the future a bit. So one thing, and I wanted to focus this presentation on one part of the research that I've been doing just because it seemed particularly relevant for the people who are affiliated with this conference, is trying to look at the local economy and what is happening in specific areas of the country. And one way that I approached it early on, and this is what Abby was talking about earlier, is how does the local spread of the virus affect the local economy? And so some of the results that she showed were at the state level, and she identified that there was at least some statistical relationship between the spread of the virus at the state level and some employment trends. But then when you look at it from different perspectives, that relationship doesn't hold exactly. And so it's not really so much a story about the local spread of the virus as it is about it impacting the economy broadly, because of course, labor markets are interlinked and it plays a big role. But one thing that I'm going to show you is that when you break it down at a smaller geographic level at county, and then also when you break it down by industry, it starts to tell an interesting story that I think helps pick out some of the unique pieces about what's going on in the economy right now. So how do I do this? First step is I'm using just the data from the New York Times, where it has number of confirmed coronavirus cases for each county. And what I do is I group the counties by number of cases over the previous 4 weeks. And then the second part, the employment data that I'm going to show, is coming from the CES. So for establishments in each of the county groups, right, I'm lumping them together by per capita number of cases and kind of bin them into 4 or 5 separate groups. And I just look at, again, using the longitudinal part of the CES, how has employment changed from February to whatever the reference month is. Okay. So this is going to seem like a really simple graph, but there's actually a lot of economic information contained in here. Okay, so I'm going to build this graph up to more recent data in a second, but just want to start with a more basic level. So what I have in the dotted lines at the top, this is what it looked like in June and July of last year, right? So obviously pre-pandemic, I don't know if any of us had ever even said COVID in a sentence in our lives as of last summer. And you can see that there's no geographic pattern as far as something being unique to the way these counties are grouped based on the number of confirmed cases. So what I'm doing is, so for July 2019, I'm using the confirmed cases in July 2020, and then binning all of those counties into these 5 separate groupings and seeing how employment changed from the prior February. So this would be relative to February 2019. And then for the purple line at the bottom, that's going to be for April 2020. And so there's a couple things to point out. One is the levels, right? The level is going to say how bad overall has employment fallen since February, right? So we're going to see negative numbers here. And as you can see from February, or as of April 2020, it was a pretty huge dip, right? Just the level shift from the top 2 dotted lines down to the April line shows a massive change in the economy that happened very quickly and suddenly, which I think we're all aware of happened. And then the second piece is the actual slope of the line, right? So this is saying how the employment change is related to the local spread of the virus in this case. And you can see that there is some correlation there in the sense of as the number of local cases increases, then you see a larger decline in employment. All right? So then when I go to May 2020, you see the line has now shifted upward, right? So employment has bounced back a little bit each month, though not quite enough to fully make up in the economy, but you still see this slope of the line. Then you add in June 2020, the slope is starting to flatten out a little bit actually. And again, you see that shift up, which says overall the economy is doing better, but there's still some sort of statistical relationship between the local spread of the virus and the employment levels at the county level. And then just the last piece where I lump together, or I bring in July and August 2020, here's where it gets kind of interesting, right? So now that slope has kind of disappeared entirely, right? Like July and August are fairly flat when you compare it to April, May, and June, which is suggesting that the connection between the local spread of the virus isn't as strong, possibly even non-existent, as the summer wore on and bringing us to the most recent version of this data. And I think there are a couple potential explanations. One could be that as the testing gets more widespread, people are their behaviors are being responding differently. Secondly, there's the interpretation of a positive case in August 2020 is different than the interpretation of a positive case in April 2020 because the testing has become more widespread. And then so basically you could look at the earlier positive tests were probably people who were going to hospitals, who actually needed some direct health care. Whereas now I think more people are getting tests done, in which case they're getting a positive test, but they might be totally asymptomatic. And I think it's catching more of those people in the population. And then it's also, I think businesses are getting better at dealing with this and making potential customers feel comfortable entering, or even maybe helping employees feel comfortable coming back to work. So the next piece that I want to look at is break the same type of analysis, but breaking it down by industry. So I wanted to show finance and insurance first because it illustrates two things going on with finance and insurance. A, there was no downward shift whatsoever. Basically, employment just totally stayed the same and there were no issues there. And then B, there's also no connection between the employment for people in this industry and then the spread of the virus. And one of the things that I kind of identified is the connection between this local spread of the virus and employment seemed to be stronger in industries where telework was less of an option. So finance and insurance, that's the sort of job where people can stay at home, work in front of a computer, and don't necessarily need to be having face-to-face contact with people. When you go to leisure and hospitality, though, you can see that there's at least from April through July, you could see stronger positive connection, or sorry, I should say negative connection. More positive cases have worse employment outcomes. In August, it's more of kind of all over the place, that slope of the line. You're seeing leisure and hospitality improve in terms of the levels each month, but the actual slope of the line was maintained for the most part. But again, it starts to flatten out more. And that could just be because the restaurants, hotels are getting better at actually trying to make customers, make employees feel more comfortable coming in. And so, you know, I think it's interesting in reflecting some of the changes just over these past 6 months about how people have been dealing with the virus itself. In retail trade, there wasn't as big of a drop in employment as there was in leisure and hospitality, obviously. And so you've seen it recover better too, where now, as far as July and August, it's fairly close to original February employment in retail trade. When you go to construction, I know there's, in some of the previous presentations, there's some talk about construction. This had a strong relationship between the spread of the virus and the actual employment levels for it. And that has maintained even through August 2020. But again, you've seen this improvement from month to month for construction, where it's essentially bounced back in terms of employment levels based on the CES and looking at it through this longitudinal lens. Through other services in there, other services is an interesting one because I think it combines both occupations that are telework friendly, and then also some other occupations that are definitely not telework friendly. So, you know, like masseuses can fall in other services, though depending on how you classify it. It actually, there's some establishments that do fall under the leisure hospitality umbrella, but other services does have a masseuse category in there. So then, just because I thought people might find this interesting, I added a bunch of maps, and I can just go through it. And if people think it's cool, I can come back to it a little later in more detail. But first, start with just the spread of the virus as of middle of August. And then for leisure and hospitality, I have the employment change relative to February as of August. You know, what I'm kind of looking at here is in the spread of the virus, which is the top map. There's kind of this, I'm looking at the light areas, like what areas have not been hit at all. And there's almost this swoosh, not quite a Nike swoosh, but a swoosh that comes from the Wyoming, Idaho, Montana area. And it goes through kind of heartland, Midwest, and then goes through Pennsylvania and up through the Northeast a little bit, where there hasn't been as much spread of the virus that we've been able to observe. And so I'm kind of just looking for how that might overlap with breaking this down by each of the industries. And so leisure hospitality, you can kind of see at least the western half of that swoosh is pretty light for the leisure hospitality grouping. When you go to construction, it's, you know, it's almost, it might be a Rorschach test thing, in which case maybe people aren't trusting me as much with my interpretation of these. But, you know, you can also see with the construction that the parts that were harder hit were the Southeast, and then also a little bit along the Atlantic coast going up, which matches, and then also into the Southwest a little bit. And so that matches the harder hit areas in the COVID map at the top part of the screen. Healthcare, it looks like this has a little bit of that swoosh aspect that I was trying to describe in the top map, comparing it to healthcare. But again, I just wanted to show these maps because I thought people potentially might find them interesting. And if you want to talk through it later, more than happy to. So just to change gears and hit a couple other points. Another interesting part of the economy is what's happening by employer size, right? So the Paycheck Protection Program targeted loans and grants to small businesses. And so this is going to be establishments that are primarily under 500 employment. And then the Federal Reserve's lending programs were targeting bond purchases from larger companies, right? So that's the secondary credit facilities. So there is a genuine interest in how by size class, how has employment been affected over the course of the pandemic. So we have one paper where we do exactly this, break it up by size class, and then we had to, again, it's all about getting creative, doing the best with what's available to us. And so we broke down employment change into 3 different categories, right? There's change in employment for continuing establishments. There's change in employment due to reported closures. And then there's change in employment due to a non-response adjustment that we created, because conditional on an establishment not responding to the survey, there's a higher probability that they're actually closed. All right, so the first graph I'll show is breaking it down by size class and showing each of these 3 components, which sum up to the overall employment change, right? And I think the most interesting thing to identify here is if you look at the top left, those are the smallest establishments, right? You can see that closures make up most of the employment decline for those smaller establishments. That's the light blue line here, right? And then as the pandemic has gone on, as we've made it through the summer, these establishments have been opening back up. So these closures were temporary, but it still made up most of the employment loss that we were seeing for these smallest establishments. Whereas for the largest establishments in that second column on the second row, you could see basically any employment change we were seeing for the 500 plus, that was just because continuing establishments, they weren't closing, they just were cutting employment for a period of time, but that it took a while to start to see improvement in that, because you can see that purple line from April on is pretty flat until it gets to August and it starts to improve again. So when we combine all 3 of these components together, we get this graph, which is, I think, a very interesting representation of the economy. So initially, heading into April, you see the smallest establishments were hardest hit. So the dip is further down for 1 to 9, 10 to 49, 50 to 99. But they also had the quicker employment return relative to, let's say, the 500 plus establishments. So you can see 1 to 9, big dip in April, and then a fairly quick improvement when you look at August 2020. It's still below what it was in February, so this is still bad. But that's very interesting, especially when you consider the connection with the PPP loans and how much that likely affected and helped some of these establishments stay open. Another version of this graph we did is, instead of breaking it down by employer size, we break it down by wage class. And this is a very interesting graph. So the orange line are the establishments that pay the lowest wage. So it's on average $20,000 or less per employee per year. And then you could see how badly those particular establishments were affected and how they also still have a long way to go before they recover to what their February employment was. So that's a big deal when you think about who are the people who are losing their jobs. It's already people who had low income, which means they already had likely low wealth and low liquidity to help respond to some sort of unemployment spell. And then additionally, they're not getting their jobs back yet. They're still stuck, waiting it out and trying to get back to normal. And so that's a big deal when trying to figure out what the best steps are as far as dealing with the potential consequences of what's happening right now. Okay. One other thing to tie back to the beginning, where I was drawing a comparison between federal government surveys and statistics and some of these private data. So some Federal Reserve employees in DC, our neighbors, they have a paper that came out this summer where they're using ADP, which is like this payroll processing company. So it's private data, and they were specifically looking at, well, how has size class employment changed over the course of the pandemic? And it looks remarkably similar to the results that we're pulling together using the Bureau of Labor Statistics Current Employment Statistics Survey, right? And that, again, this is just to emphasize, we don't need to go crazy trying to find new sources of data, because we have an awesome survey that exists right now that is able to paint the picture of what's happening in the economy. And in this same paper, they also break it down by wage class, and you can see again, our results are very similar to what they were able to identify using their paper. So yes, because it's higher frequency, larger data, they're able to go on a weekly basis, which has value, sure. Whereas we were only able to do it monthly. But the overall patterns and representations of what's happening in the economy are represented, I think, almost identically between the two pieces. And the very last thing I'll say, what's some new data BLS is coming out with. So there's a survey we've been working on since April. It's just out in the field, and we're about to pull the plug on because I think we may even hit our sample size today. It's an online survey of about 600,000 establishments. It's going to be called the BRS, the Business Response Survey. Topics cover telework, federal assistance that an establishment received, health insurance, experiences over the course of the pandemic, and then also payroll decisions. This should be out in October, at least the first release of some of the results. So happy to answer any questions people might have about that. But look forward to that because there's already some very interesting results we're seeing coming from it. So I'm Mike. Nice to meet everyone. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Well, thank you, Michael. We appreciate your presentation. There are a couple questions that trickled in, and if we had one that asked exactly how you were using the CES data longitudinally for your change in employment numbers. I mean, a lot of us are very data and methodology driven, so.
Yeah, I mean, so the way it works in the CES is establishments are surveyed for typically 24 months. There's some variation in there. So what that means is a very large portion of the sample that was interviewed in February is still being interviewed as of August and is still going to be interviewed as of September. So I just set the sample size, set the sample dependent upon having a valid response in February for an establishment, and then looking at what their responses were in August, September, or any other month since. And then specifically either lumping the groups together, you know, depending on which analysis we're looking at. So like for this, the size class estimates, we know all the establishments that are in size class 1 to 9, lump them all together, see what their total employment was in February, look at what their total employment was in August, and then do an employment percentage change between those 2 months.
Okay, I have a question, and maybe it's a recommendation or a different view to that. Is you showed us by wage class, you showed us by, say, percentage change. Have you considered using contribution to that change as a way to visually present the relative import, say, of the smaller businesses, you know, less than 10 employees versus larger ones over 500, et cetera?
Yeah, we could certainly do that. We're like trying to finish up this one draft, and so if that's of particular interest, maybe we'll throw that in there because that makes perfect sense that people would be interested in taking a look at it in that way.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? We don't really have too many coming in on my screen here. Oh, there's an anonymous person here. How can CES microdata be accessed?
So
they're public use files, or do we, you know, do they have to go through the
research data centers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe the only way to access it would be through the research data center. To my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but I haven't known any outside research that have come in specifically to use the CES microdata. But it's available. So I think you can email me if someone's particularly interested, and I can forward to the people who make these decisions. I know things, again, are a little weird right now as far as access to the research data centers, just because usually for the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, you have to actually come into the building. Whereas I know Census has a little bit easier time accessing their data through the research data centers. But I would imagine something like this, an agreement could be worked out. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other last minute questions? I don't see any. So why don't we move on with you, Andrew?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So thank you all for giving me an opportunity to present to you all today. As you can see by my slide, I'm Andy Hait. I'm an economist at the Census Bureau. I've been working at the Census Bureau for almost 33 years, which is a little frightening to think about. And I've spent my entire career working in what we call our economic directorate, which is the part of the Census Bureau that does the business surveys. So today I get the chance to share a little bit about what we've been doing at the Bureau on COVID-19. One of the real joys, I will say, of going last from the presenters is I get to build on everything else that the people before me built on. When Dr. Wozniak started off this morning, my heart sank and rose at the same time when she started talking about the Household Pulse Survey, because I have a specific slide on that survey. Because since she did such a great job of covering it, I won't cover it to the extent that I would, but I was really thrilled to see how much the folks at the Fed are using that Household Pulse Survey. So to get me started, I want to provide just a little bit of context about the Census Bureau. With this audience, I'm sure you all know this probably as well as I do, but we do so much more than just simply count US population once every 10 years. If I had $1 for every time someone said to me, Andy, I know what you do once every 10 years, what do you do the other 9? I would be retired by now. In fact, we conduct more than 130 monthly, quarterly, annual, and periodic programs each and every year. They include, of course, the decennial census, which we're doing right now, but they also include an annual program, an annual household survey called the American Community Survey, or the ACS. And actually, I think Abby actually mentioned the data from the ACS prominently, was featured throughout her presentation. These are great programs, and they coincide with a lot of our annual business surveys. But as you all know, they tend to produce a lot of really rich data, but not necessarily the most timely things. The 2019 ACS one-year estimates were quite literally just released last week. The 5-year estimates will be released in December for 2019. So using the American Community Survey to help identify communities that may be being impacted by COVID-19 because of their race or the ethnicity of the people who live there, or the household income, or the disability status, or the occupation and industry statistics, those wealth of data that come from the ACS, those data are great to help identify areas that are potentially being impacted. But where these annual programs aren't as valuable is in measuring those people that actually are being impacted, that are not just sort of a historical reference, it's current data. So when we think about the impact of COVID-19, the first programs at the Census Bureau that started seeing impacts of COVID were our 17 leading economic indicator surveys. As you all probably know, the Census Bureau does 17 of the 22 leading economic indicator surveys. They include programs like the monthly retail trade survey. If you were to look at that data in April and going into May, you would have noticed the immediate precipitous drop in the retail and accommodation and food services sector. If you were to look at the monthly manufacturer shipments, inventories, and orders report, the M3 survey, you would have seen how new orders for certain types of products measured by the M3 took a pretty precipitous drop-off during the beginnings of the COVID pandemic. We are now playing catch up in many of those manufacturing industries. I don't know if any of you have done what my wife and I did in March, but we went and joined the herd and bought a travel trailer in March. In March, before the pandemic hit, the local RV dealer close to my house had probably 400, maybe 500 trailers and RVs in their lot. I think they'd be lucky if they had 100 left. And right now, those RV manufacturers are playing catch up on that huge demand that was then that then showed up because we were all sick of being stuck at home and we wanted to get out and do something out of the house, but we couldn't do it by going to a hotel, or we didn't want to do it by going to a hotel. Well, what a better way of going to visit the country by packing up your house in a trailer and taking your house with you. So these timely economic indicator surveys began to give us information about the impact of the pandemic. But the other major sort of caveat with these monthly economic indicators is the level of geography that is shown. With only 2 exceptions, all of our leading economic indicator surveys are shown at the national level only. The only 2 programs that produce data below the national level are our residential building permits survey. It's a monthly survey that publishes data on building permits. Data are shown down to the county level, and in some cases, even down to city level, if permits are being issued at the city level. That's a monthly survey. The other monthly survey that we have is the survey that publishes data on imports and exports, our international trade program. And again, there's a lot of people that started looking at that trade data when they started seeing their US markets drying up during the pandemic, and then started wondering, well, I wonder if I could export my products. Where are other businesses like me exporting their products to? What countries? But with only those 2 exceptions, the monthly economic indicators only publish national data. So we started thinking about what we could do to fix this. And the very first survey we thought about, especially in our economic directorate at Census, is something called the BFS, the Business Formation Statistics. This is a program that has been around for decades. This is an annual survey that takes information that we get every single month from the Internal Revenue Service on business applications. When Andy decides he's going to quit working for the US Census Bureau and start my own consulting business, one of the first steps I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the IRS and I'm going to say, I need an employer identification number, or I'm now going to form my business. When Andy does that, the IRS sends the Census Bureau notification that said Andy Hait just turned in an application to start up his business. And we started noticing, even as early as March and the beginning of April, a drop-off in those filings that we were getting from the Internal Revenue Service. The staff that work on this program said, I wonder if we could do something with this. So basically what we did was we took a survey that used to only be updated annually, and we're now updating it weekly. So you can now go in and look at it on a week-by-week basis, data on business applications broken out by business applications from corporations, high propensity business applications, and business applications with planned wages. Data are shown in this program, not only the estimate, but also the year-to-year percent change, and the data are published down to the state level. There are no NAICS detail, there's no sector breakouts like we would have in other surveys, but this is has been a really interesting program to see information about startups. How have they been impacted by COVID-19? And as you can see on the slide, I've included a couple of links both to the BFS homepage and to this actual interactive visualization that I have a screenshot of on the right-hand side of my slide. In this visualization, you can choose the period that you're interested in. This happens to be looking at week 20 of 2020, and you can go in and look at the business applications to see how they are being affected in that state, at that state level. The data are shown by region, but I will say for most of you, the state level data is probably going to be what you're going to care the most about. Now, business formation statistics looks at startups, new businesses, but we also then said, well, the monthly economic indicators are measuring these larger, primarily measuring the medium and larger sized businesses, but what about small business? What can we do to understand how our small business is being impacted? So this next slide is from a survey called the Small Business Pulse Survey. It may sound familiar to what Abby was talking about this morning. This is actually the business side of the Household Pulse Survey. The Small Business Pulse Survey ran for 9 weeks. There was then about a month gap where we were standing up phase 2 of the Small Business Pulse Survey, and now we are into the second week of phase 2. Currently, the plans for phase 2 are to continue this survey through the end of October. But I'm going to right now, and I'm going to say it again at the very end, you all have an incredible role that you can play in encouraging our senior staff and the Office of Management and Budget to allow us to continue this survey beyond the end of October. When Dr. Wozniak made a comment in her presentation this morning about wanting 2 years of data, I could have reached through the computer and hugged her, because I would love to be able to see these surveys continue into next year at the very least. I will say this though, in my 30+ years at the Census Bureau, I have never seen us go from ideation of a survey to dissemination of data from that survey in as short a period of time. The Small Business Pulse Survey was essentially stood up in less than 60 days, which in the federal space that I have lived in for the last 30+ years, that is like a blink of an eye. It's a positive miracle. It's a COVID miracle that we were actually able to get OMB to give us approval to conduct a Small Business Pulse Survey and get data released within 2 months. The data in this survey are shown by nation, state, and by state, and they are shown by 2-digit NAICS sector. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a chart that looks at the data for each of the 2-digit NAICS sectors. It should come as no surprise to any of you on the call today that NAICS 72, which is the accommodation and food services sector, the second to last bar on the right. I know that font is really tiny, probably hard to see, but that sector was the one that was affected most. Small businesses were affected the most by the pandemic. We already heard previous presenter mentioned the finance and insurance sector. NAICS 52 that's one of the sectors that has that little bar. But I was also surprised, but not surprised, to see that NAICS 22, which is the utility sector, has actually seen the least impact due to COVID-19. This is not a sector, NAICS 22 is not a sector where telework is possible. This is a sector where the workers have to go into their power plant or into their transmission facility to work, but by the nature of their occupations and their jobs, they are socially distanced by definition. So we probably ought to all be happy that our local utility did not have a reduction in their workforce during this summer. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting at home watching this webinar, because we wouldn't have electricity. But you can see the other sectors that were really impacted. Again, data are shown at the national and state level. These data, again, are being released on this dashboard that we see here, but in a few moments, I'll talk about another way that you can get to these data in another platform. Now, as Abby mentioned in her session this morning, the sort of most popular, if you will, of these pulse surveys that we have at the Census Bureau is the Household Pulse Survey, where the Small Business Pulse Survey asked businesses about what their overall impact was, whether they had to change their business model. Are they now providing carry-out or drive-through services that they didn't have before? The Household Pulse Survey asks households how they were impacted, how they are currently being impacted by the pandemic. You may be a little hard to see, but on the left-hand side of this display, you can see it asks them questions about, did they experience any loss in employment income? Did they experience any food scarcity? Could they maybe not get out and get groceries? Did they have to delay medical care because of the pandemic, either because they didn't want to leave their homes or maybe because their doctor's office was closed? Did they experience any housing insecurity? And a variety of other questions. Now, like the Small Business Pulse Survey, this survey ran for a number of weeks. It also has paused, and we are getting ready to stand up the second phase of the Household Pulse Survey. I have provided here a link to this visualization where you can go ahead and get that data, and you can see it's a pretty nice visualization. As Abby did mention, these data from the Household Pulse Survey are being released at the state and metro area level. And I will tell you, give you a little bit of sneak preview, there has been some talk about expanding the coverage of both the Household Pulse and the Small Business Pulse Survey to provide data below the metro area level. To do that at the Census Bureau would require us, of course, to increase the sample size so that we would be able to publish the quality data that we really feel is necessary. We're pretty nerdy at the Census Bureau. A response rate of 30% that might make some people cheer, makes us cry. Most of the business surveys that I work on at the Census Bureau have a minimum 70% response rate. In other words, we will suppress the data from that survey for that geography and industry if less than 70% of the businesses responded to that question. So we're pretty nerdy. For the 2017 economic census, just to give you an example, we had an 86% response rate for our 2017 economic census. So we've talked about business formation statistics, we've talked about the Small Business Pulse Survey, we've talked about the Household Pulse Survey. The last of the 4 programs that I want to talk about is something called Community Resilience Estimates. As Dr. Wozniak pointed out, the American Community Survey produces an amazing wealth of demographic, socioeconomic, and housing data. And some of the staff that work in one of our program areas realized that if they were able to apply risk factors to the micro level data available from the American Community Survey, they could then retabulate that ACS data based upon those risk factors and use that data to understand how resilient or not counties are, cities are, metro areas are, when it comes to not only pandemics like COVID-19, but other types of shocks, whether they be fires or floods or earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes, etc. So they've now created something called an experimental data product for community resilience estimates, where they have applied those 11 risk factors to the micro level data available from the American Community Survey, and then have retabulated it to find those areas that have a large percentage of the population that live there that have no risk factors, where it's sort of a very resilient community, have one or two risk factors, maybe it's not quite as resilient, or have three or more risk factors, in other words, sort of the least resilient. Right now, those 11 risk factors are being applied evenly across. There's no prioritization, they have not been ranked, they have not been applied a weight to those risk factors. So one of the asks I'm going to have of you all is to please, please, please share your opinions of this data with the staff, because they are looking at continuing to upgrade and update these community resilience estimates. And if you feel that for certain types of disasters, certain risk factors ought to then be given a higher weight than others. So for example, one of the risk factors is access to transportation. If I am in the path of a hurricane and I don't have a car to flee my area, the hurricane is usually moving slow enough that I can probably find some other way to getting out, or maybe where those other risk factors like my income status or other disability status might be impacting my ability to flee as much as the access to transportation. But if I'm in the path of a rapidly moving forest fire and I don't have a car, I am in a whole world of different hurt. Now, of course, I had to pander a little bit to our president of our association in showing data for the state of Montana here. But again, you can go in and use this visualization here. It's fully interactive, and choose the different state. You can look at both counts and percentages, and you can go ahead and limit the geographies based upon population range. And then you can see the county estimates are then shown below there. On the left-hand side of the slide, I have included the link to the Resilience Estimates website. Again, I believe that these presentation materials are all going to be shared with you all after the conference today, and I would encourage you all to check these all out. Now, we've talked about these 4 programs that were specifically stood up to help us measure COVID-19. When we were coming up with those programs, each of the programs realized that they were going to want to release the data on their program page. The Census Bureau conducts more than 130 surveys. We have more than 130 program pages that you have to go to find the data from each of those 130 different programs. It's maddening. But a couple of our executives came to myself and a few other people at the Bureau and said, Andy, you work a lot with Esri. Do you think that you could use some of the credits that we earn every year because of our contract with Esri to get them to build for us a platform where we could consolidate a lot of this COVID-related data so that it would make it easier for people who aren't familiar with the Census Bureau, who have no patience to wade through 130 websites to find the data that they care about? Do you think that they'd be willing to build a hub for us where we could put selected statistics from these programs, sort of a one-stop shop? Of course, I wouldn't be telling you the story if it wasn't a good story. So of course I said to them, yes, of course we can work with Esri. They would love to have us do. And the result of that work that started back in March is something called the COVID-19 Data Hub. What you are looking at on the screen are just 2 of the 7 or 8 different major features, major components, dashboards, if you will, of the COVID-19 hub. This hub includes about 120 data variables from the American Community Survey, sort of the key risk factors that we were beginning to hear from agencies like CDC and HHS and FEMA, et cetera, those major risk factors for COVID-19. It includes data on the demographic side. It includes data on both employer and non-employer businesses from the side of the Census Bureau that I work in the business side. So that covers those self-employed people. And the data also includes some statistics that we actually pulled in from Esri that they provided. I am not going to get a chance to do a demo for you. I want to make sure we stay on time, but I would very much encourage you all to check out this COVID-19 hub. The link to it is in the upper right-hand corner, and the bottom left-hand corner is our main COVID-19 resource page. What I will tell you is this feature, this hub, has a couple of key features. First, it has these interactive visualizations. It has dashboards like on the left-hand side that you can click on. All of those variables are selectable. You can filter, you can do a whole bunch of things. The data are shown at not only the state level, but they are also shown down to the county level. You can see I filtered this map to show us data for Hudson County, New Jersey, which is right on the other side of the river from New York City. On the right-hand side is one of the 8 I know it says 6 there, but this is screenshot's a little bit old. We just recently added 2 more. 8 what we call policy maps. These maps let you drill down to the census tract level and produce information on specific risk factors for COVID-19. The data are available on this hub for download. So you can download the information in the normal CSV and Excel type file formats. But in working with Esri, we've also incorporated all of this data into the ArcGIS platform. So for any of you who have GIS professionals that work for you or that are available to you in your offices, they can actually take all the data that we've already put into map services and into layers. They can actually download that information and incorporate this data in your own COVID hubs, in your own platforms, in your own dashboards. So I'm very happy for this, of our work on this. I'm one of 2 people in our academic directorate that have been on this team since March. COVID has sucked away most of my my life in the last 6 months in working on this platform. We are constantly updating it. So when you go in and check it out, if there's something that you don't see in this hub, please, please, please email me. I will give you a little bit of a sneak peek about what's coming in the future. All 4 of those business surveys that we talked about, the business formation statistics, the small business pulse survey, the household pulse survey, and the community resilience estimates, all 4 of them are being fully incorporated and built into this actual hub. Right now, 2 of the 4 are there. The last 2 are just links, where at least you can get to the data from the hub, but they are being incorporated. As many of you also know, there are a number of other federal agencies that have stood up their own COVID hubs. And in working with those other federal agencies, a number of them have come to us and have said, you know, this is silly for us to build a hub and for you guys at Census to have built a hub. Can we put our data on your hub? And we actually just received on Thursday last week approval from our senior execs to actually start that process with FEMA. Currently, FEMA has about 40 data sets that they are hosting out on an Argonne National Labs site. That Argonne site right now is password protected. You need to actually have access to the data. They then said, could we put this data on your site and make it available to the public? And we said, well, of course you can. So then we got approval to do it. We've got the funding to now do it for them. So we're going to be pulling over a lot of that data that FEMA has on the Argonne site into this COVID hub. And that's probably going to be happening in the next couple of weeks to months. Fingers and toes crossed that FEMA data will be completely incorporated by November or the beginning of December. So we'll see. So essentially, guys, that is sort of my presentation, talking about what's coming next after all these. The business formation statistics will continue publishing weekly data. Eventually, this program will transition back to an annual program, but we are getting such positive feedback from users about it that I think that transition probably won't happen until next year, maybe in the middle of next year, when we go back to a regular annual program. The Small Business Pulse Survey, as I mentioned to you all, is already in phase 2. The questions that were asked of businesses on phase 2 are, of course, a little different than the questions we asked in phase 1. There's some things that doesn't make sense for us to be asking businesses in phase 2 that made sense in phase 1, and vice versa. So for example, we've just added a question about rehiring of staff. Has your business started bringing back staff that were laid off at the beginning of the pandemic? And if so, how many of those staff are you bringing back? It is unclear whether there will be something beyond phase 2, but the very, very last note at the end of this slide is that you, as the member of this association, have a distinct role that you can play if you want to help us keep these programs alive. My senior execs that I report to, I have already told them how impressed I've been in the year or so that I've been associated with AUBER, that perhaps you guys should be listened to. So if you think that it's important that we continue these pulse surveys beyond the end of October, please, please, please let me know. I will give you my associate director's direct email address and his direct desk phone number. Household Pulse Survey is currently planning a phase 2. I think it is going to happen. As Dr. Wozniak mentioned, the data are really valuable. So having that data moving forward would be great. The community resilience estimates will exist beyond the COVID platform that they've done so far, but they are actively soliciting feedback from users on how they did this work. So that's pretty important. And finally, last point I have here is that this COVID-19 hub will exist through beginning of 2021. We've gotten funding to carry it through until the end of January, but we'll see if we keep having data to put on it, we'll see how long we keep it live. And again—
Well, thank you, Andy. We only have, I guess, about 6 or 7 minutes until our time is up, and I've got a bunch of questions that could probably half an hour.
Yeah, let's go.
Have, a couple questions related to, if you could keep it down, the elevator pitch, if you will. The degree to which COVID has complicated the data collection process or increased the challenges? You know, for the employment survey, for example, they would have some that were face-to-face, and now it's on the phone, right? So what are the other challenges you are facing?
So real short, as you can imagine, we've had a major impact to the ongoing decennial census operations due to COVID. Hurricanes don't help either when you can't send staff out into Louisiana because the state's getting hammered by a hurricane. But it's interesting to note that all 4 of those COVID-related programs had almost no impact from COVID in terms of our collection. These surveys, excuse me, are all either from administrative data, like the small business, or like the business formation statistics, or they are synthetic, if you will, programs like community resilience estimates. The 2 pulse surveys are 100% email based surveys. It is the first time that we have done a complete survey 100% via email, and the success we've had of it has actually been quite good. So
I wanted to applaud you and all of whether it's your contacts at OMB or whatever else, because 60 days, I used to work for a statistical agency, 60 days, oh my goodness, that is lightning fast.
Exactly, Tim. In my 30+ years, I have never seen us spin a survey. So OMB, credit to them in recognizing that this was something we really had to do, but our staff also just made such a compelling case that it was important that, yeah, so I'd love to take credit for it.
So in terms of the community resilience estimates, so how is it different that, or what's the theoretical foundation for that? Because Susan Cutter has been producing their social vulnerability index that pulls together a lot of these data items.
Right.
How is it different?
So the key difference between those other measures and CRE is that those risk factors were applied at the micro data level. So instead of taking already published summary level statistics and identifying those at-risk geographies based upon already summarized published data, by applying those risk factors back at the micro level, it allowed us to cross-tab the data in ways that you could never do from either the summary data or even something that you couldn't even do from the PUMS data, from the public use microdata sample file. They're not detailed enough to allow you to do that cross-tab. So this was a really interesting application of existing data resources that now can produce estimates that are very different than what that survey ever used to produce.
Well, okay. One question there was for Michael. Someone wanted you to comment on the BLS inflation measures, given that the basket of goods that we're buying has changed, shall we say, from back in February to now. It's a lot of products out there just aren't available to purchase.
Yeah, that's a big deal. I mean, I'm on the unemployment statistics side, so I don't work specifically with the CPI or prices, but that's absolutely a super important part of this is, given even just hearing the stories of people going to grocery stores more versus restaurants and how that's affecting, whether we're seeing any inflation just in grocery store prices and how big of an impact that could have, particularly when you think about lower income people who were already relying on grocery store trips instead of restaurants. And so that's the sort of stuff that I think is immensely important. Unfortunately, I don't have any particular insight on the BLS side just because I don't work with that program, but that's a key thing right now. And especially there's so much talk about inflation generally of, how much is the fiscal support actually causing any sort of inflation? And I think being able to nail down these answers is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Mike. I got a nod that we could have maybe a couple more minutes. So Andy, if you don't mind me going back to you, in terms of the C19 risk factors, you presented that map of New York and Jersey there, and it was by tract. Is there a particular factor or collection of factors that were driving the dark tracks versus the light tracks in that picture?
Yeah. So each of those policy maps show a single statistic. So, for example, the population below the poverty level. There's one that is for a population that has $75,000 or less of household income. Why those geographies were the way they were, I'd have to look at, dig into that a little bit more. I've got my email address and phone number here up on the slide, so if folks have specific questions when they get a chance to go look at it, I'd be more than happy to walk through it with them.
Okay, are there any other questions from the, for the good of the order, from the other viewing public here? So I have a question in terms of audience for some of these data sets, whether it's the resilience estimates or the C19 risk. Is there a particular audience that you are trying to reach? What policymakers, researchers, practitioners, is there going to be somebody that goes there and says, oh, wow, this is for me, this was designed for me?
Right.
That might say, this is kind of too complicated.
Right. So the COVID-19 hub was clearly designed for that data user who is not familiar with Census Bureau programs, doesn't have the patience or time to wade through a lot of detailed programs to find the data that they need. So I would say that platform itself was specifically created for sort of a more entry to mid-level user, which some might argue are some of our policymakers, where you need to sort of spoon feed them some of this data. They need it already kind of digested. So whether it's policymakers in state and local government, whether it's emergency management staff that need to be able to apply some of these kind of risk factors to understand when they're responding to those areas. The tools themselves, the programs themselves have a much more power user sort of audience, because those people, a lot of AUBER's members are going to be what I would typically think of as a sort of a power user. They are familiar with Census Bureau programs. They don't need a platform like COVID-19 Hub to be able to access it. But even for them, I would say the fact that we did all that GIS work to make the data accessible in a mapping application, that now you can take all that work and build it into your own maps, that's why we did it. So.
Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Mike. And I'm going to close out this session and move on to Pat.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Andy. Always a highlight of our AUBER meetings. And I also very much appreciate our hardworking federal employees finding a way to figure out how they can use Zoom, which has been greatly to our benefit. Okay, we're about to kick off our business meeting, and our business meeting is for everyone. But just to make sure we don't lose anybody, I want to make sure you get a very important message first. So I'm going to ask James McCafferty from Western Washington University to tell us a little bit about the reception that's going to happen in just about a half an hour. James, you want to go ahead?
You bet. You know, the AUBER reception is kind of a famous thing. I think I've read about it in most journals. Don't you think, Pat? Most journals? Sure. So after we are done with our business session today, I'll put this link in the chat here for you as well, but we have a Zoom room set up that you can come. Unfortunately, these bottles are mine. You'll have to bring your own, but it's a great opportunity to network with some folks, and we're gonna do some different activities to kind of break people up so you can get a chance to meet some folks and share what's going on in your world.
Thanks, and look for that link in the and that'll be kicking off right at the top of the hour. All right, well, good. Well, welcome to the AUBER 2020 business meeting. Like everything else in 2020, this one is distinctly different. For one thing, we're not holding it at 7:30 in the morning, so perhaps we'll have a different kind of business meeting, but of course we're virtual. But we want to give a report to you on what's going on in the organization, talk a little bit about our plans for the upcoming year, and have a chance to hear from you about any issues or questions you have about where we're going and how we run. So I'm going to kick this off. I'm Pat Barkey, I'm president of AUBER, and I'm going to turn this over to Mike Hicks. And I'm going to ask Mike to give us a report on our finances from the Secretary of Treasury's office. Mike, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Pat. It's good to be with you at this abbreviated meeting. Just very quickly, we have a ending balance as of 8/31 in checking of $12,964. We have a savings balance of $20,046. We have, it changes every day, a balance in the $68,000 range for our investment fund. A revenue collections to date for this year, 13, these are net of the credit card charges, are $13,095.60. We have 51 centers that have renewed and paid to date, 5 individuals. There are 3 of these are new, 2 new centers and 1 new individual, and we have not received revenues from 8 centers, and include mine as one of those. So that's typical for this time of year, despite the challenges for research centers. We're pleased to have had a number of renewals and actually new memberships so far this year. And I will say we also, because we've moved our, I'm sure Pat will talk about this, we've moved our conference in Boulder to next fall. We do have some holdings there to reserve that facility for next year. So financially, we're in fairly robust shape this year, and we've had fairly stable membership over what has been obviously an extremely turbulent 6 or 8 months as we opened up our renewals. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mike. We can use the Q&A here if you have any questions on the AUBER financial report. Feel free to chime in. I'm not smart enough to Zoom to figure out how to vote, so I think we're going to accept that report. Move, seconded, and voted all in one person. Thank you, Mike. And it's good to know that at least one rainy day fund is managing to stay out of that dreaded red box that you put up there for all those other states. Let's move on and talk a little bit about membership. We have a membership committee, and of course, a membership in AUBER is a little bit different than some other organizations. Members are centers, not individuals, although we do have individual membership. So I'm going to ask Juliet Tenert, who's what are you now? You're vice president. I got to get people's titles next to their names. Sorry about that, JT. And Juliet, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, give us a membership report, and maybe you can also fill us in on the special survey that took place of AUBER centers over the summer.
Yeah, excellent. I will do that. I put together a couple of slides, and I'll try to be really brief because I know that our reports are standing in the way of getting to have a drink before 5 on a Monday. And so I'll try to get through this quickly. Let's see. All right. Pat, thumbs up. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Looks good.
Okay. Now I think it will work for what we're doing. I'm just going to try to make it a little bit bigger. Let's see. I give up. Okay, let me make it that a little bit bigger anyway. All right, I am, again, membership. It's as as one of the board members working on membership, it's kind of a bummer not to get together with everyone in person this year. So just some remembrance of our time together in Savannah, but still really impressed with the turnout for today's meeting. So all great on that account. Some reiteration of what Mike presented on financial status, and some of these numbers won't be exact. We worked on these last week, and obviously things change, but as economists, we're okay with a little bit of gray, so you won't get too concerned if my numbers are 1 or 2 off. But I think we have about 65 members. Still, I guess, a handful are unpaid. But I'm really impressed at how strong our membership has been and how many centers have been able to make those membership renewals. As a reminder, most of us are center members. We've got about 6, I think the most recent count that Lisa and I were looking at. We've got about 6 individual members. We have, I'm saying 4 new members. So we've got the University of South Alabama and the George Washington University. There's been new membership there. My understanding is California State at Bakersfield will be joining us shortly. And then the Marshall University in West Virginia have participated with AUBER for some number of years, fell away for a bit, and they're back. And so I think the state of the AUBER membership, given the global pandemic, budget cuts, we talked about the stress to state and local budgets. I think the state of our membership is quite strong. We did have one center, the University of Memphis, that closed this year. So that's very sad. It's a loss. And then we have had one other center report to us that they're unable to make dues for the year because of budget stress. So except for that one center, we anticipate collecting dues for our other memberships. As Pat mentioned, we did a summer check-in survey. Hopefully those of you that are on the meeting right now will remember that happening. Although again, pandemic times, I don't know what was last week, what was last year, what was last month. But we opened up that survey late July into early June. I have to thank my colleague, James McCafferty at Western Washington, for playing a major role here and really getting the momentum to get this going. It was really meant to be a check-in survey. So normally we do an all-member canvas. Given that people are all over the place, most people are working from home, kind of hard to reach out, we decided to do this survey. And we had 3 major objectives. Really just checking in to see what members are up to, given the state of affairs. We wanted to see what our members' awareness was of the virtual roundtables that we've been holding, and then also the fact that the conference was moving online. So just wanted to check in and see what people's level of awareness was. And then we wanted to kind of ascertain how members are feeling about the value of the organization. We have an email distribution list of 625 individuals. So when we talk about that 60-some members, you have to remember associated with those centers are numbers of individual people who get this value from AUBER. And so our email distribution list is 625. That included members and those that we think of as friends of AUBER. We had 112 responses with an 87% completion rate. So we felt really good about that, given this kind of random survey showed up in the summer around a holiday weekend. So thank you to everyone who provided information there. I did a report on the survey findings in our July AUBER meeting. The board has all of the raw data. If any of the members outside of the board are interested in the details of this, the detailed results of this report, just check in with me and I'll get you connected with the data. But I kind of major findings, I just put the results of two of the major findings. Which of the following have you been involved? What type of research have you as a member been involved in within the past year? And we had kind of a list of options. And then of course, folks that also provided a lot of other types of research that they're involved in. But really a main takeaway here was just to see how active our members are in providing policy analysis for the COVID response. So many members are doing specific impact analyses. They're doing forecasts for COVID and doing just general COVID-19 public presentations. So this was done in July. And so I suspect that if we were to do the survey ever again, we'd actually see those numbers increase. But nothing really surprising, seeing what our the types of research that our members are engaged in. But it was a nice check to just show that we are really at the forefront of some of these issues that our states are facing. And then the other kind of major highlight for me, we asked the question, and on purpose we didn't put the dollar value associated with membership. We asked what members think of the value that they receive in their AUBER membership, and the majority of our respondents did agree that the amount of value they're receiving from AUBER is about right for what they're paying. So that was a nice check for us, and I think we always, as a board, are continuing to talk about how do we provide value to our members, and so we still need to keep our eye focused on that. But this was a nice check in there. James, do you have anything to add? Kind of since I shuffled it down just to 2 points.
No, I thought that was great. I think that the survey was fun because we got to not only get that kind of data, but we also had people type in some things they were doing and things that of interest. And you guys are all doing such really cool things. So there's a lot of things to share. And so in our virtual gathering here following this, there's a lot of things for you guys to share with each other.
Yeah, thank you very much. And like I said, I think a big part of the value in doing that was just to make sure that we maintain that connection with our members. So finally, I'll end up with a couple of insights. The most important insights. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Lisa. So Shannon is just, I really think of her as the heart and soul of membership. I mean, she is, if you don't know who Shannon Furness is, if you're a member of AUBER and don't know who Shannon Furness is, I'm going to have to check in with you because Shannon has just kept us all together, especially even in this time where, we're all dealing with budget issues. We're just trying to figure out what we're doing. Shannon's kept in touch with many of our members. She'll report back to me, I talked to so-and-so, I talked to so-and-so, this is how they're doing. And so I appreciate that Shannon just continues to have that connection with the membership, pulling together the newsletters. She is, 100% to receive the credit for our new members and the recruitment of those new members. And so I just truly appreciate all the work that Shannon's done for the membership committee. And then of course, Lisa, just making sure that we got all of those membership invoices out. And you can see that, I was really impressed to see how the majority of our members did make their dues. And that, I think a lot of that's work we're thankful to Lisa for her work in just getting the invoices out and then kind of touching base with folks to make sure that we're collecting those dues. So that's like the biggest thing. And then between, my time kind of thinking about membership over the past year, doing the survey, participating on the board, I think retention is really important for membership. Again, I've been impressed with the strong renewal numbers. I think it really speaks to AUBER's value. There's no other professional network like ours for the type of work we do. And I think that when you saw the presentations from earlier today and the panel discussions, you see why our professional network is so important. The work we're doing right now is so important. I think member awareness is important. It's interesting to see, if I even looked at the registrants for today's conference, there's a number of folks from centers who identify themselves as being non-members. And so I think that we as center directors need to make sure that our staff actually know that they are AUBER members and therefore have access to the full value of AUBER. And so just want to make sure that there's awareness of what membership actually is and who has that membership. And then I think that the virtual value is important. So the roundtables, the virtual conference today, I see that as really helpful to our members. And so I hope that, as kind of leadership, that as we work towards the conference next year, we don't forget how important what we're doing right now virtually is, and hopefully we can continue to do some roundtables and connections with our members. And then finally, for recruitment, these virtual events are reaching so many people, and so I hope that we can leverage our connection to these possible new AUBER members. Normally we have a conference and we have 20, 30 or so folks who attend our conference and become AUBER members, individual members, through that interaction with us. And since we didn't have that this year, I'm concerned about what that means for new membership recruitment. However, I think that our reach is even farther than it normally would be with an in-person event. So we'll continue to look for opportunities to leverage that connection. And I just know that Shannon is right on that, and I appreciate that. And then I'll just remind everyone on the call that as we have these virtual events, please make sure that you're sharing them with your networks, because I think that that helps us to, it's not only about recruiting new members, it really is about, getting people, again, that value that we're providing. So connecting our value with that potential new audience. And so I would just encourage all of our members to, share the AUBER love, share your love of AUBER. All right, and that's my membership report.
Wonderful. Questions for Juliet? Not seeing any pop up. So I think next we're going to ask Brian Lewandowski from CU Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, to make a comment or two about some exciting things coming up for 2021. Brian, it's all yours.
All right, thanks. Pat, can you hear me, Pat?
Yeah, you're fine.
Fantastic. So first and foremost, just want to thank the AUBER organization and the annual conference planning group who really pivoted on this year's conference and put together a great program today. It moved really swiftly. You had really great speakers, and so thank you for doing that, despite the fact that we couldn't be in Boulder this year. But we will be in Boulder next year, and I'll give you a very brief rundown of what this is going to look like. So the 2021 annual fall conference will be hosted by the University of Colorado Boulder. Just to plug our university a little bit, this is an organization with $700 million in annual research funding, about 35,000 students, 10,000 faculty and staff, 4 Nobel Prize winners, and a really world-class reputation for aerospace, engineering, biosciences, chemistry, and so on. Boulder is a community of just over 100,000 people in a metropolitan area of about 300,000 people. In addition to the university, the community has 13 federal labs and joint research institutes. Boulder has 12 accelerators and incubators and 18 co-working spaces. It's a very entrepreneurial and innovative economy. VC-backed firms raised over $1 billion locally over the past 2 years. Long ago, Boulder captured the attention of industry giants like IBM and Ball, and has recently seen companies like Google and Twitter descend on Boulder, mostly through mergers and acquisitions. Right here, you're looking at a picture of Chautauqua. Sometimes Boulder is referred to as a Republic of Boulder. This community outsourced funding in the late 1800s to get the University of Colorado flagship campus. They actually went door to door and collected funds so that they could have some matching funds for the state legislature. They then donated land to get the federal labs that are in Boulder, and the community was early to tax itself to preserve land as a public good for nature and for recreation. And we now have 155 miles of trails locally that serve as a gateway to the Rocky Mountains of the West. When you visit Boulder next year, bring your jogging shoes, bring your hiking boots, even bring your bike. There's plenty to do outdoors here. Boulder is adjacent to the Denver metropolitan area with over 3 million people and a host of cultural amenities, including the Denver Center for the Performing Arts, the Rhino Art District, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and it's all within a 30-minute bus ride from Boulder. We're serviced by the Denver International Airport, which touted nearly 70 million passengers annually prior to the pandemic, which made it the 5th busiest domestic airport. Right now, we tend to be first or second in the country as we're coming out of the pandemic. But just so you know, as you're planning your flights, 86% of passengers are served by United, Southwest, and Frontier Airlines. When you arrive at DIA, the drive from the airport to Boulder by bus or by car will take about an hour. The conference itself will take place at the Hotel Boulder Auto. This is the oldest hotel in the city of Boulder. You'll be able to choose from rooms that are very historic or contemporary. We negotiated rates down to $239 per night. And the hotel is just steps away from the Pearl Street Pedestrian Mall with dozens of eating and drinking options, though fewer options than we had prior to the pandemic. We've seen a few succumb to the ill effects of the pandemic. Here's a brief summary of the conference. The date is to be determined. We had it scheduled for September this year. Next year, we're leaning towards October, but it'll happen sometime in the early fall next year. And when you're here, we are planning a tour. I mentioned a little bit of Boulder's tech economy. We're planning on making the tour revolve around these technology companies and have a reception that revolves around Colorado's craft beer industry. So while there are some unknowns, we'll just keep in touch with you in early spring to let you know more of the details as well as the hotel discount code. And I'll turn it back to you, Pat.
Thank you, Brian. Great. Looking forward to it. And now we come to a very important part of our meeting, which is our awards. And we're ready to make some publication awards. And I would ask the chair of the Publication Awards Committee, past President Sean Snaith, to make the announcements and let us know who the winners are. Sean, it's all yours.
Thank you, Pat. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Well, each year AUBER presents awards to its members for publications and websites to recognize the excellent work that's done at centers across the country. And this year in particular, we have some winners that really are the best of the best and you know, serve as great examples and a source for other centers, I guess, to help step up their game and help make improvements on their publications and their outreach to their particular constituencies. We had submissions for 2 of the 3 award categories. We had submissions for website excellence, and we had submissions in print publications. So there's no award for electronic publications this year, but the winner for among the submissions for website excellence this year is the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization. Their director is Carl Bonham. The editor directly responsible for website production is Victoria Ward. And congratulations to them, to Kimberly, to Peter, Philip, Justin, Leah, and Christopher, all of you hero who put together this outstanding website. And, you know, I invite all AUBER members and others to spend some time, take a look at the great work that they've done. And I'm sure we'll have the link on the AUBER website so you can see exactly what this organization has achieved with their website. So congratulations to the University of Hawaii. This is sort of like Jimmy Kimmel, right, at the Emmys. It's just it's just quiet here, but I'll try to do my best. As I said, the other category in which we had submissions this year was the category for excellence in print publication. And congratulations to the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana. They have won for their Montana Business Quarterly publication. Director at the University of Montana BBER, Patrick Barkey, the president for life of AUBER. And congratulations to him and to the editor, Scott Hawk, who's directly responsible for production of their publication, the Montana Business Quarterly. And congratulations as well to the rest of the team, Robert and Brandon, who helped contribute to production and layout and content of the excellent Montana Business Quarterly publication. So congratulations, University of Montana. Congratulations, University of Hawaii. And we look forward to receiving your submissions for 2021 at the conference in Boulder. And lastly, Thank you to the judges who participated in evaluating the submissions, and a reminder to the winners that you're now obligated to serve as a judge for next year's awards. Thank you very much. Congratulations to all.
Thank you, Sean. Well, we're almost at the close of our meeting, and I know it sounds like I'm holding you back from the party, but I heard from the party host that some dean at Western Washington is hogging the Zoom channel, and so it won't actually be available until 10 minutes after the hour, which is, of course, what can you say? This is the part of the program where there's remarks from the incoming president. And so this is a little awkward because the board decided, because of all the tumult in the organization, that we were going to hold over the old guard. So Sean made the comment about president for life. We did not run board elections or officer elections this year. And so you're kind of stuck with us as the leadership of AUBER for another year. If you can get over that, then let me just make a couple remarks about the organization, and then we'll close up the program. The first thing is I want to echo the comments that have already been made, especially by Brian Lewandowski. I would like to thank all the folks that helped AUBER run this year, including our membership consultant, Shannon Furness, clearly the Secretary Treasurer's Office at Ball State, led by Mike Hicks, with Victoria Meldrum and Lisa Goodpaster, and my fellow officers, Sean Snaith, John Deskins, and Juliet Tennant, together with Mike Hicks, have done an outstanding job. I think when I came in as president last year, I remarked that there were 3 things that we needed to do as an organization, and that seems like 100 years ago because there's been so many new things added to our plate. But I think we've come close. We wanted to get to a membership total of 65 centers. We still could be there. Juliet is doing a great job, and I think we're in striking range of getting our membership, and that's important because that reverses a trend of slow erosion. I said we wanted to make some progress on making AUBER financially sustainable. You heard a good Secretary Treasurer's report, but I will tell you that there's much work that needs to be done there. This is not the time to be talking about re-engineering our financial model for AUBER, but there is some work that needs to be done, and so that's to be continued. And the third thing is I wanted to make our committee structure work better. And I think we've made a lot of progress towards that. And our committee structure of AUBER is really the heart and soul of the organization for making things run, because we all do have day jobs running our centers. So of course, we've gotten a lot of new challenges handed to us. I think the most important thing that we need to do, and it's something that Juliet Tennant said a few minutes ago, and that is to reach out to other like-minded centers, like-minded individuals, not like-minded from a cultural point of view, but I mean in terms of what we do professionally, the kinds of challenges that we face, and the kind of information and resources we can share with each other. Reach out to those folks, tell them about AUBER if they haven't heard about it already, and I think that'll be very very beneficial to keeping an organization going that's been around since 1947. So it's a little daunting. I thought I would be the only president of AUBER ever to not preside over a meeting, but look, I get a second chance. So let's hear it for the vaccine and hope it happens, and we do get our lives a little bit closer to normal in 2021. So if there's no other business, then I am going to declare the meeting over. We have a reception following this. I think that link, I'm not sure what'll happen, James, when people go to that link early, but presumably it won't be good. Whoops, you're muted.
You can't read my lips. It will put them in a waiting room. So
okay,
while we vacuum the floors and make it a nice space.
Yeah, the tradition of the membership of the hospitality suite with the locked door. I believe we've had a few of those in our history. So wonderful. Well, folks, it's been we're making lemonade out of these lemons, and I think we made some pretty sweet lemonade today. Thank you for John Deskins for putting together this great program, and thanks to all the presenters. I move that we close out the business meeting. All in favor? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. So thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes at the reception. So long, everybody.